our capital program. Budgetary performance was assessed as strong. Our liquidity is, liquidity is our ability to deal with our obligations, whether there are debt obligations or employee compensation obligations. Given our investments and our cash holdings, liquidity was assessed as exceptional. Our debt burden are tax supported, so they are very focused on our tax supported debt burden. So again, tax supported excludes our water, wastewater, storm debt and our development charge related debt. As it relates to our tax supported burden, that burden was assessed by Standard & Poor's as very low. And finally, our contingent liabilities, and those are our employee-related liabilities and our closed landfill. Those are our two principal contingent liabilities. They were finally assessed by Standard & Poor's as very low. So those 8 principal weights are the factors that Standard & Poor's would have considered. Again, it's a third-party independent assessment of the city's financial position. And again, this is our second consecutive year of an improvement in our credit rating. And finally, I just want to thank Glenn and his staff, the Economic Development Division, as well as Jerry Boychuk, our Chief Investment Officer, and Brian McMullen and their staff, who were part of our meetings with Standard & Poor's and who provided all of the information to Standard & Poor's so that they can conduct their review and come to their outcome. Thank you.
Mr. Deputy Mayor, I through you want to thank Mike Zagarrett for the fullness of this report back. I can tell you that it sometimes is the case when I'm speaking to residents that there's this hysteria of this almost like apocalypse that's happening here financially, and it's just not reflective of what we see before us here today. The second year in a row, increased credit rating. So through you to maybe Chris Murray, what approaches are we taking, or what plans do we have around communicating this story? Do we have press releases going out? Is there an op-ed coming from your office going to the business section of the Spectator? How are we communicating this to the business community at large and to some of the more fiscally prudent financial hawks that are out there who might sometimes talk about with hysteria the way that our city is being managed?
So through you, Mr. Chairman, so there are communication people who are aligned to Mike's department on this particular matter. There isn't anything that is top of mind in terms of tactics that we're going to employ, but your point is well taken that we need to be, I think, maybe more deliberate with the message that Mike is sending. So if you want to leave that with Mike and I, and we'll work with Andrea and her team to make sure something is put together and published.
Maybe we can get Glenn and his staff to set up a consulate at CHCH or the SPEC to get this story out. Mr. Deputy Mayor, I didn't want this just to kind of roll by without it being acknowledged. The work around this table and as well as with our finance department, you know, it amazes me when people talk about the city in a way that is not reflective of the reality, the doom and gloom that's out there and all that other stuff. I think this is a great news story, and it's something that we need to be singing from the mountaintops. We need to aggressively pursue in a communication strategy out to our constituents through every media that we can so they understand their tax dollars are being managed in a responsible way. Thank you.
Councillor Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I want to echo those comments. You know, when I read through this report, what really jumped out at me was number 7, the debt burden. The debt burden being very low, and in the explanation in the report, it says Hamilton's debt burden is considered very low. The tax-supported debt level is expected to regress to just below 23% of consolidated operating expenses in 2019, from where it was at 31% in 2016. And I think that's significant because, you know, I think all of us around this table at some point in time when we're out in our communities or in the broader city, we do hear comments about Hamilton is, you know, really ready to blow apart and it's so heavily in debt and people don't know what they're doing and blah, blah, blah. And that is just not true. In fact, it couldn't be farther from the truth. And I agree, we need to take this particular document and do some really good press releases, media releases around it. Because I agree, we should be singing from the mountaintops. If nothing else, What we need to do is just correct the misinformation that is out there. And, you know, through no fault of residents in this city, I really think we've just not done a good job of communicating, particularly when we have this particular good news. Me, myself, personally, I'm going to put this in my newsletter, and I would really encourage everyone who has a newsletter or website around this table to do the same thing. So thank you, Chair. I appreciate the latitude.
Thank you. Motion's on the floor. All in favor? Any opposed? Carries. Lisa, come on up. Lisa Pasternak's going to provide a presentation on the modernization of Ontario's Municipal Legislation Act, and she'll provide a summary of the changes. It's nice to see Lisa back at the podium. It's been some time.
I actually think I've never presented from up here to the chair. So I presented from back there, but not from up here.
So far, you're doing phenomenally well.
I'm trying to find Stephanie? Presentation. Oh, okay. Slide. And then I just click. Okay. So this is about Bill 68, the Modernizing Ontario's Municipal Legislation Act. There's a lot of legislation right now, as you well know.
Right.
The definition of meeting is clarified to require that a quorum be present and that business is materially advanced. Electronic participation in meetings will be possible when the meeting is open to the public and the members participating electronically is not counted as part of the quorum. So a limited type of participation, it would have to be added to the council procedure bylaw. The exceptions allowing for meetings to be closed for the consideration of particular subject matters will be expanded to include this list of 4 items. It's information explicitly supplied in confidence by other governments. So at the provincial or federal level, certain commercial type information, both of third parties and of the city, and also things related to negotiations. These are not yet in force. They do mirror what we already have under the Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, information which does not cannot or does not have to be disclosed, so it's nice to have that balance now that the two reflect each other. Or have it in the future. So under planning, both of the changes with respect to planning are in force. An agreement containing conditions on a permit to convert or demolish rental residential property can be registered on title and therefore enforced against subsequent owners. So we could always do this, but now we have the ability to register on title. And the list of matters of provincial interest is expanded to include the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and adaptation to a changing climate. So there are 3 new policies that municipalities will be required to have. These, again, are not in force yet. There must be a policy for council municipal employee relations. As you know, we already have a number of measures in place with respect to this matter, and including our council employee codes of conduct, and these will be cited in the policy as part of our framework. Also have a policy for protection and enhancement of the tree canopy and natural vegetation. The city, again, has a number of measures already in place. You see them some of them listed there, and those would be form part of the policies to describe what framework we have in place for this. The third is pregnancy and parental leaves of council members. So this is new, and it will be set out in a policy. What it does is it provides for 20 weeks without making the individuals ask for permission. So you no longer have to, you wouldn't have to ask for permission. It's, as of right now, the 20 weeks. You have to do it again. So a grab bag of a few other changes, and these changes are in force. Again, just expansion of a power that was already there, an outline of what community councils may be responsible for and what their composition may be is set out. A very useful provision giving the city authority to enter onto land adjoining its land for the purpose of maintaining, repairing, or altering its land. We, of course, have to leave that property in the condition in which we found it and not leave it, alter it that way, but we are able to go on when we need to maintain our own land. The municipal auditor is no longer required to approve record retention periods, and then the mirror to this policy that we're required to have as a member of council may be absent for a maximum of 20 consecutive weeks as a result of pregnancy or the birth or adoption of a child without their office becoming vacant. So those are,
Great.
that's a summary. I just say that the report also has a column in the table. Council last year requested certain changes of the province, and that column tells you what you got and what you didn't get from those requests last year.
Say that again, sorry, Lisa.
Sorry, last year, council requested certain changes be made through
Right.
this bill in a report that was sent off to the province, and the table in the report tells you which ones you
right.
asked for and you received and which ones you did not get.
Okay, 4 speakers. Councillor Marulo, you're first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Lisa, just on the one issue surrounding election finances, are you aware of the process regarding the scrutiny associated with the submission of a member's filing upon completion of a campaign? So in essence, what I'm asking you is the process, has it changed from what we had, or will there be more engagement from either the city clerk's office or an independent body to oversee the submission rather than the gotcha submission process we have now, where somebody could actually innocently make a mistake and it be considered a violation?
Not through this act, but through another act that was passed earlier, yes, there is more oversight from the clerk's office in reviewing the submissions being made, and there are a number of changes made through that. Still remains that there can be a hearing. Election Compliance Audit Committee remains in place. That was not consolidated at a provincial level as was requested, but there are a number of measures in place, such as being able to correct financial submissions during a certain period of time that were made to make it somewhat of a smoother process, one hopes.
And that would be subsequent to the submission then?
Sorry?
So you'd be able to amend any oversight subsequent to the submission?
There is a period of time to be able to do that,
Okay,
yes.
because I think that's vital. And one thing, in all my years in politics, and when I was involved at the provincial level, they had the Commissioner of Election Finances. And when they had this Commissioner of Election Finances, it was a work in progress. So you submitted it, they threw it back to you and said, these are the issues that need to be completed, or there's an error, or it needs to be amended. It was really a collective approach to finding a filing that would be considered complete. The way it's set up now for us is that we submit it, and it's like a black hole. There's no point of return, and most of the errors or so-called violations are really just oversights and not technical violations. And the perception of a violation versus an oversight is quite distinct, and one that can be used politically to manipulate the message. So I'm glad to see that they've taken some type of mitigating initiative, but I'd like to see them even take it further. And I'm not wondering, do we still have an opportunity to make a submission or provide input on that issue, or is that, we're beyond that?
Through the chair, not that I'm aware of, but I certainly will go back and look, because the two bills that we're dealing with the Municipal Elections Act are now have received royal assent.
Okay. Okay, because that, I would have liked to kind of been involved in providing some input, only based on having them really comply or create a system similar to what they're using in the provincial ridings. And I'm surprised that they wouldn't consider that, considering they feel it's a good process for themselves. But having said that, perhaps I'll take that offline, determine if we can provide any input, and go from there, and I appreciate your time. Thank
you. Councillor Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And along the same lines with the elections, what is the impact for a candidate wanting to fund their own campaign? I wasn't clear on what these changes. Does that formula impact? Because right now, there's a $10,000 limit that you don't need to provide audited statements, up to $10,000. There's some other things in play right now, but what about if a candidate isn't taking donation and is going to fund their own campaign?
Through the chair, I don't think it's any more limiting than what already exists. It just provides more certainty, but I certainly will have clerks review that in particular and compare it to what exists right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And Chair, I mean, I think that's important because, you know, I know in the past that there have been a couple of councillors who have funded their own, and if there is a change to that, it would be, I think it's only fair to let any future candidates as well know up front if there's any restrictions on that. Another question I have is, with regards to the Integrity Commissioner now being mandatory for all municipalities and boards, what about the boards, and I'm thinking, you know, what about boards that don't have their own Integrity Commissioner? Are they going to use the municipality's Integrity Commissioner? Just provide a little clarity on that for me.
The legislation provides for flexibility in how that's implemented, but the most likely model, which some municipalities already do, Toronto, is that it's a single integrity commissioner for council and also the local boards that fall within that definition. So business improvement areas, those types of entities.
Okay, because I'm just thinking of, that would apply to the outside boards, like the library board as well?
It does not. There are certain boards that it doesn't apply to. The police services board, the library services, they remain on their own.
Okay. All right, thank you, Chair. And then I just have one more question. With regards to the conflict of interest, now providing it in writing, does that need to be done in writing at the beginning of every meeting, or can it be put in writing once and then kept on file and the councillor just references it with each appropriate meeting?
Again, the legislation is not specific as to exactly how this is set up, and there will be work done with clerks about how to do it in a manner that is transparent and also efficient.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. And Lisa, thank you for the presentation. If you could just, I've got on three of your slides, I've got some questions. So if you could go back to one of your earlier slides, please, of codes of conduct and the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act heading, that'd be great. And as you're doing that, Lisa, I've always appreciated any professional discussions we've had, and your presentation today highlights the thoroughness of your knowledge and you imparting that knowledge upon members of council. And I'll just say that for myself directly in terms of whatever the issue has been, Mr. Deputy Mayor, from a legal standpoint, Lisa, I've appreciated you being in the department to guide us. Okay, so top bullet point, coming into force at a future date. What does that mean? You'll be kind of like, hey, when you hear, you're going to let us know, or is this next year, or what's your take on that?
The province will likely proclaim it, giving a date in the future when it comes into force. Right now, there is no date whatsoever. On these particular items, the feeling amongst municipalities is that a significant amount of time will be given because it's mandatory and because a number of the 444 municipalities do not have integrity commissioners or even codes of conduct. When these accountability officers were first brought in the last round of amendments, and it was discretionary at that point. Municipalities were given a year to, if they wanted to implement this. So the sense is that there will be some amount of time to do this, probably about a year.
Okay. So obviously, we're one of the few municipalities that, if you will, has been ahead of the game from the Integrity Commissioner's Office standpoint, about 10 years, I would say, in terms of the bylaw and having an Integrity Commissioner. So all of these bullet points on this slide, Lisa, just what you explained, all of them fall under that top bullet point, that at a future date, any of these changes whatsoever will be at a future date, or does that just apply to setting up an Integrity Commissioner for municipalities that don't have one, Mr. Deputy Mayor?
Through the chair, it applies to all of them.
All of them, okay. So, further on this, the fourth bullet point, there'll be a protection from the IC investigation during election period. I believe currently the election year, what is it, August 31st? After that, if there's a filing after that by a citizen against a candidate or a member of council, then it's not disclosed, because obviously it could influence the election with an investigation during that time. So if memory serves me right, Lisa, currently it's August 31 of the election year. Can you confirm that, please?
Through the chair, I'm sorry, I don't have the bylaw in front of me. I believe it's
Sooner, later?
roughly that.
Roughly
I think
that
it's
time?
90 days, so I think
Could you
it's
confirm that,
roughly-
maybe just an
Yes,
email after today,
yes.
just that for sure, thank you.
Yes.
And that last bullet point then, again, if it's all at a future date, but I want to be clear, to declare a pecuniary interest, as you know, we all, if we have one at committee or council, we all do it at the beginning of the meeting, and we do it verbally, but it's noted in the minutes and the reasons why. Are you saying when this comes into effect and enforced, that we'll have to give some written submission to the clerk before the committee or council meeting occurs, Mr. Deputy Mayor?
Through the chair, no, it's not necessarily in advance. It could be after the meeting. That gets filed, that statement has been made. It's
Okay,
not
so let's-
necessarily that the public registry part of it has to be done before the meeting occurs.
So let's play out a hypothetical. I got a pecuniary interest, I declared verbally like I normally would do, and you're saying, Tom, sometime after that, if you can submit something in writing confirming what you did verbally, is that kind of what you're getting at? Because I would have thought that you want that ahead of time, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
It's not going to be sometime after. It'll have to be within a certain specified time.
Okay, all right. Okay, so that's to come, but again, that's all at a future date on that slide. Could you flip over to the next one, please, elections? Thank you, Lisa. So under the third bullet point, it's been increased. So it'll all be now individual contributions, which I think the federal government has had for a few elections now. So first of all, can you confirm that's all individual and no more corporate or union for next year, Mr. Deputy Mayor?
That's correct, through the chair.
Okay, and will there still be the stipulation on an individual that will have a I think the current maximum amount was 5,000 for union corporate in the past, across any and all candidates in a particular election. Are you aware of, is there still a maximum cap that'll be applied now to individuals, Mr. Deputy Mayor, through you?
I'll have to check that in Bill 68, and
Okay.
I can't recall about
If you could just confirm that one as well,
Yes,
please, Lisa, take
yes.
that under advisement, that's great. And last slide, Lisa, please, your meeting slide. If you could turn to that for me. Terrific. Okay, third bullet point, interesting. So if somebody is on vacation, out of town, but obviously an issue of import, calls in electronically, if I read this correctly, they can offer advice and participate in the conversation and debate, but because they're not counted as quorum, they will not be able to vote electronically from out of town, wherever they are. Mr. Deputy Mayor, through to Lisa.
That is correct.
Okay. And lastly, the next bullet point, this is interesting. exceptions allowing means to go in camera for consideration will be expanded. Interesting. To include. So I read through these. A lot of these, Lisa, to me, I wrote down the word same with a question mark. I mean, labor negotiations, contractual matters that may have some real estate value, whatever that the corporation needs to protect, personnel matters. I'm trying to figure out what's the additional ones that maybe I'm missing here, Lisa. Could you help me with that, please? Or is it in the ballpark of the categories I've mentioned?
Through the chair, there is some repetition, duplication, but it is also an expansion. There was not a general exception for the first sub-bullet point for information explicitly supplied in confidence, no matter what that information is, from Canada, province, or territory or crown agency. In commercial relationships, when you're looking at the next two, it really was limited to labor relations or property. This has the potential to apply to other commercial relationships. And the same type of comment on the last one about negotiations, which was fairly limited to employment or land. It has the potential to apply. There are still it is limited, and these have been litigated and decided very thoroughly under Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act.
Right.
And those are the limits that we will be ensuring apply as well when these are used.
Sure. So as legal and clerks do, guiding us throughout, if we're going in camera, here's the reasons always stated why. If we're in camera and suddenly something should be in public, we all do the timeout. We say that has to be discussed in open session. But I was just curious that through the Ombudsman and now the province of Ontario, they're actually expanding some of the considerations to go in camera. But again, it'll be within categories and it'll be identified as to reasons and why you are. But there might be some additional reasons for going in camera. Those are my questions at this time. Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Councillor Jackson. Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and thank you, Lisa, for the information. A couple of points, and some have been raised already, but I just want to ask, going back to members of council and declaring pecuniary interest, which I have several times. Once it's registered with the clerk, we file a statement. Do we have to continually declare conflict at committee meetings, or is it once and done?
Through the chair, you will have to declare the conflict each time it comes up. How that works with the registry and recording it, I don't think it necessarily means you would have to go back and complete a written statement. It may be that just the minutes are reflected in that public registry.
And the statement stays in the clerk's office, so that would be on record. You wouldn't have to do that every single time. Okay, thank you. Next question, the elections issue that you're going to look into, the question that was raised with regards to capping. On the finance, tax collection, tax sales and investments page, you mentioned that changes include shortening the time period for registering tax arrear certificate from 3 years to 2. Does this now mean that a city can actually put a property up for sale in 2 years as opposed to 3?
Yes, it does.
Super. Okay, thank you.
And that was one of the items that council had specifically requested.
And wow, that shortens the window for residents, so we have to get that message out there loud and clear. Thank you. And I also on the, just clarifying under planning, an agreement containing conditions on a permit to convert or demolish rental residential property. It can be registered on title and therefore enforced against subsequent owners. So that's not done now? So it's like the site plan agreements, et cetera?
No, it's a very narrow, particular area where on those, that rental situation, building situation, and it's not, in these certain areas, you require specific authority to register on title because the registrar doesn't necessarily accept them as affecting property in the same way as those other types of agreements you're thinking about. So this is the ability to do it is explicit.
And really what they're doing is saying, okay, so somebody has an agreement, they decide to pursue an application and process conversion or demolition of a rental property, but they sell in the meantime and then once they sell, somebody else comes in and they don't know what's going on, and they have no idea that there's been rules and regulations put in place of what they have to follow. That's why this is being registered, correct?
Yes, and they would know through the process of the sale about it because it's registered on title, so they would go in knowing exactly what affects the property.
Super. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Pearson. Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. A couple of questions and some clarity. So on the one slide in elections, I think Councillor Partridge sort of asked the question, and I've been sort of following the presentations and consideration before things went to, is it Royal Assent? I'm trying to understand, at one time there was contemplated a capping for individual donation, the candidate's donation or self-funding a campaign. That was entertained. You're indicating there's a formula. My understanding that formula is the same formula that's in place today in regard to determining the total expenditure based on population per ward, but there's no other formula that limits the donation of self-funding candidate.
Math is not my strongest point. I will confirm what that formula is. It certainly does now explicitly import a formula and require a certificate be given, and I will certainly answer the question about how that differs from what exists now.
Yeah, because like I said, that's why I'm confused, because at one point they did contemplate a capping, and then at some point I think reading the legislation post Royal Assent, it wasn't there. So I'm a bit confused on this formula piece, if that's tied into the calculation of what you can spend per ward, or there's another formula that we haven't seen yet.
Certainly, there is now a distinct certificate from the overall spending certificate that will be issued. The difference between the calculation without a certificate being issued that existed before the passage of this act and what is there now with the certificate being issued, I will track down for.
The next question, and again, dovetailing on Councillor Jackson, there was a reason, and I understand it, in regards to capping the total donation by corporate or union within a municipality during a municipal election. Now, unions and corporations are not allowed to donate to individual campaigns. So the question is, have they provided a capping to just individuals to donate to candidates within a municipal election? And I'm talking about a total, so I know it's 1,200, but is it 5,000 cap? Is there a cap at all?
There is still a cap. I don't recall, I'm thinking right now that it stayed at 5,000 for the total for the individual to give, because otherwise I would have tracked it as a change, but I need to check that.
So the change, so was it always 5,000 for individuals, or was it only 5,000 for corporate and union?
It was both. Okay,
thank you for the clarification. Also my understanding, and I'm not clear if this is in there, it's a bit foggy. They changed the legislation and added third-party advertising during campaigns. Is that correct?
Yes, they did. Not this bill, but a different piece of legislation. Yes.
Oh, is it a different piece?
Yes.
Now, my understanding is that unions and corporations can donate through that third-party system. Is that correct?
I'm not as up to speed on that, but that's my recollection of it, yes.
So we're adopting sort of American-style system?
Or test driving it for the province. It would be.
Fair enough. It's just something new that I thought I'd highlight.
Yes.
That's still a bit confusing in regards to third-party donations. If you were to select one of the key issues that as a council working with our solicitor that we had suggested for consideration and change, that was not adopted, what would it be?
That's an interesting question.
Kind of fun and challenging at the same time. Use your discretion, Lisa.
I have to look at the table again, so just a moment, please.
Maybe while you're looking, Councillor Whitehead can suggest what he thinks is the appropriate answer, because I think he knows.
I have a number of them. I'm a bit concerned that I think that we made a very thoughtful, considerate, comprehensive suggestions. I know our lawyers worked together at the clerks. I think we're involved to some degree in providing suggested changes that this council approved, as I recall, and was forward. There's a few on that list that were never considered or adopted. Maybe an easier question, so I don't want to put you on the spot. Can we highlight through a chart, because I don't see the chart here, what was adopted in regards to our suggestions and what was not?
I have, that is
it's in
in
the
the
report?
third column,
Oh, thank you.
and
I can see.
I think, I mean, my own choices are influenced by areas I work in, but the failure to deal with the heads and beds payment, I think, is very important. And that's been on the table for a long, long time, and nothing has been done about it.
And I appreciate that. I know that a number of us around this council have been making the same argument. The last time that number is, when it was originally instituted, I think was based on in the 70s, early 70s.
It's old, yes.
And it hasn't been revised since, so the revenue generated when you're a large institutional town is significantly shortchanging the cost of inflation even over the years since the 70s. So it's a huge gap between what we're currently receiving and what they should be paying if we just apply cost of living. Is that correct? Thank you.
Yes, and you've been a champion of the issue, and keep plugging away on that one. It's important to all of us, Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you.
Councillor Green.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Forgive my cynicism, but as I read through this, I see nothing substantive in terms of oversight and/or repercussions. So I'm looking through the codes of conduct, and it all seems like it's stating the obvious. They've added in the following list of principles that include the municipal conflict of interest, and they go in item 1.1 and they state the absolute obvious. Yes, 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 yes. All of this stuff seems apparent. Mr. Deputy Mayor, I've read Mayor's Gone Bad in this country. Interesting book, talks about malfeasance and governance at the municipal level, corruption, criminality, talks about all of that. This legislation doesn't deal with any of that. And so the only point that was of interest for me was the penalties that a court can impose when it finds non-compliance with the MCIA are expanded to include a reprimand or suspension of remuneration, and loss of office is no longer an automatic penalty. So my question to you is, what in here, because that's just the MCIA, what in here of the Code of Conduct provides any type of substantive oversight of municipal government? Mr. Deputy Mayor, we've had mayors in this province be on drug deals, smoking crack, hundreds of times. Nothing happens. So, you know, I'm looking at this modernization of the municipal legislation. Where in here is the actual oversight?
Lisa?
Well, I think you have hit on the most significant change, which is the added flexibility to the courts, which was advocated for because it was felt the courts were very reluctant to make negative findings because of the only extreme penalty available to them. So that particular change.
But a reprimand? Like, that's not a that's not an outcome. That's a strongly worded letter.
Well, there is also a financial penalty in the remuneration, the suspension of remuneration. So there is also a financial penalty.
So, Mr. Deputy Mayor, all of those, respecting the fact that that's the MCIA, relate specifically to conflict of interest within municipalities. And we've seen some creepy stuff happen across this province in the last few months. People just, I think about that person up north who's got the people's photos on the walls and different types of, targeting of individual employees and members of the community and the public. What in this bill, under the Code of Conduct, gives the province oversight to provide significant repercussions for malfeasance or criminality?
Lisa?
The repercussions in terms of the Code of Conduct have not changed. They are still the same list that you are aware of. The change is that it's become mandatory and it's expanded to local boards as well, with the same possible repercussions of reprimand and suspension of payment.
But there's still, Mr. Deputy Mayor, my cause, and this has been raised around this table, my cause for concern is that they've gone through this whole charade of modernizing and they haven't added any teeth to the legislation. They're essentially allowing, the fox to guard the hen house by allowing municipalities to set up a minimum standard of integrity commissioner oversight. We've seen what inept integrity commissioners look like in terms of how they operate in their investigations. And I'm not confident that this legislation does anything substantively to change the culture of malfeasance at the municipal level, which I think has the greatest opportunity for small c corruption, big C corruption, criminality, and malfeasance, and we've seen that. We've seen that with, the Rob Ford effect. We've seen that in some of these other smaller municipalities where land deals are tied to family members and so on and so forth. And I'm not seeing anything in here that deals with the real issues at hand. What I'm seeing is window dressing. And so I can appreciate where this government wants to go with the illusion of progress and oversight and control, but I just, unless there's something that I've missed, if what you're suggesting is that we can have people across this country, or in this province, break the law repeatedly, and still not lose office or not have any type of oversight, then we really do have a situation where it's municipalities run wild, gone wild, or whatever, however you want to put it. So can you point me to anything in here that provides any type of oversight? Is there new powers inside the Ombudsman's office that provides not just reprimand or review, but actual feasible oversight?
Through the chair, I've explained what's there. I'm not advocating for it, against it. I'm explaining what is there. So. Sure.
So I appreciate it. It's here. I've gone through it. We're now able to mail in our participation in meetings here by Skype or whatever that is. We can be at our cottage, it looks like now, participating at meetings. That's great. I'm looking at this. We've asked for a long list of things. There's no recommendation on the table. I just want to go on the record right now and say I feel like Bill 68 is a bit of a facade, and I think that there's still incredible gaps in governance at the municipal level. And I think absent of any kind of real oversight and control, you're going to continue to see the type of gong shows that we're seeing across this province. Those are my comments on this. There's nothing to vote on, but as you can see, I'm a little bit disappointed with what the province has brought before us.
Well, you don't have to receive the presentation, but we'll get to that. Second time speaker is Councillor Marula.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And actually, on the point, I want to emphasize one thing, because Mayor Eisenberger isn't here. And I know at the time in 2007, I strongly supported not only the Integrity Commission, but the Code of Conduct. And at the time, I think the mayor was taking some heat, I think even around the table. So I do want to applaud his efforts, because he has a tendency not to applaud his own efforts. So I just thought I'd take the opportunity today to do that. Thank you.
Appreciate you doing that. Move to receive the presentation. That's moved by Pearson, seconded by Councillor Johnson. All in favor? Any opposed to the presentation? Aye. Okay, Councillor Green. Mike Zagaric, make your way up. Lisa, you had a multitude of municipal changes, enhancements, all sorts of work to do there, and you succinctly offered a synopsis today, and we appreciate your work. Thank you very much. You work very, very hard for us. Madam Clerk.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we also need to receive the report.
And to receive the report, it's Councillor Green.
Just for clarity.
Johnson, all in favor on receiving the report. Councillor Green?
Just for that, we're very clear. Lisa's first presentation at the podium, I was not voting against her presentation.
Of course not.
I appreciated how she talked around the topics that were before us. I am voting against this charade of a bill. Thank you, Councillor Marula, against receiving it.
Okay, all in favor? Carried. Any opposed? Welcome back, Mike.
Great. Good morning. And welcome back to Councillor Pizzuta, and I'll apologize in advance for my 40-slide deck, 40 slides this morning to Councillor Pizzuta. But this does represent the official start to the 2018 budget process, and you'll see a bit of a change in terms of this year's presentation from previous years, is that it is a comprehensive budget presentation in that it includes both the tax-supported and the rate-supported outlook and guideline requests. So again, in terms of 7.2, there's really three parts to the report under agenda item 7.2. The first is a recommendations as it relates to the 2018 budget guidelines. Again, there's a recommendation as it relates to user fees. There's a recommendation as it relates to the tax-supported capital budget process, and a recommendation as it relates to the proposed rate budget increase. There is an ask of committee today to provide a guideline as it relates to the tax operating budget in terms of the percentage target that committee would like staff to work towards as part of the 2018 budget process. And again, that is an ask as it relates to departments as well as boards and agencies. So again, that is part of today's presentation and the report before you. Also is the budget schedule in terms of the 2018 tax and rate supported budget schedule. That is before you to approve. And finally is an outlook. Staff have compiled a preliminary outlook for 2018 as it relates to both the tax, operating, capital, and the finally on the rate supported side as well. So again, I apologize. It is a long presentation, 40 slides, but part of the contribution to the length of the presentation is the fact that it is now a comprehensive presentation, both tax and rate supported. I think I'm going to have to ask Stephanie just to help me with the clicker here. And I'll jump ahead as Stephanie's just making that final connection. I'll just jump ahead to the outline of the presentation. Again, we'll start off the presentation with some context, some historical context in terms of the last few years, going back as far as 5-10 years in terms of what's been achieved previously on principally the tax-supported side. Our 2018 tax-supported operating budget outlook, our recommended tax budget guidelines, our rate-supported operating preliminary 2018 outlook, our rate budget guideline, finally the budget schedule, and just a few short slides in terms of where we stand as we transition towards multi-year business plans and budgets. Just in terms of some historical context, I thought it was important just to remind committee and the public as to what we were able to achieve principally over the last 3 years. And so you'll see in terms of the overall tax impact, residential tax impact, in 2015, it was approximately 2.7%. In 2016 was 1.7%. And in 2017, 2017, 2.1%, and the 3-year average is 2.2%. There were some factors that varied over that time period, and so again, just to focus on 2017, that was the start of a new reassessment period, so we had a very different experience in 2017 that contributed to that overall 2.1%, in that the relatively strong residential housing market in Hamilton provided for a different experience here in Hamilton and contributed to that, in part to that tax increase. So again, just to highlight in terms of what was achieved, and you'll see the breakdown, city departments on average over the 3-year average was 1.7%. And again, this is exclusive of inflation. Boards and agencies was 0.4%, and that is principally driven by Hamilton Police Services as well as Hamilton Public Library. Those are the two principal agencies as it relates to boards and agencies. Capital financing on average was 0.5%. Earlier this morning, I spoke to the credit S&P credit rating report. They've identified that the one constraint the City of Hamilton has that relates to our average assessment in terms of budgetary flexibility is our infrastructure deficit. So I just want to recognize Council's commitment towards capital through those 0.5% capital levy increases. Those contribute probably somewhere in the area of $4 million each and every year in additional capital funding. So again, it's an important strategy towards addressing our infrastructure deficit. If I look across the service areas now, just to further consider over the last 5 years, which areas have we made some investments to, which areas their maintenance budget have driven that final outcome. What we've done a little differently this year than previous years is we've provided some context as it relates to the specific experience we've had across the various service areas. So the red line represents the city's departmental levy increase over the last 5 years. It's somewhere in the area of 2.6%. And what you'll see is some variability in terms of the various services as to where they've arrived on average over that 5-year period. Ontario Works, you can see, stands alone. And that decrease in Ontario Works represents the provincial upload in Ontario Works benefits. So you'll recall that the province of Ontario made a commitment towards uploading Ontario Works benefits. Administration continues to be cost-shared 50-50. That, just as a reminder, that Ontario Works upload benefit comes to an end in 2018. The province of Ontario will have fully uploaded Ontario Works by 2018, and so that represents an annual benefit to the City of Hamilton of about $3.2 million. Each and every year, that upload reduced our levy pressure by approximately $3.2 million. So again, 2018 will continue to have that experience, but that will be the last year of the upload. Effectively in 2019, the province of Ontario will have fully uploaded Ontario Works benefit. It will represent a risk in terms of if there is an economic downturn, that risk will be principally borne now by the province of Ontario. The City of Hamilton will continue to have a partial contribution to Ontario Works benefit. The City of Hamilton, Ontario Works administration, that funding continues to be cost-shared 50-50 with municipalities in the province of Ontario. So just working down, you'll see in terms of the percentage changes over that 5-year period, building and library, economic development, HR, Hamilton Fire, information technology, all are below that departmental average. Hamilton Police Services is right at that departmental average. And then when we look at operations, housing, public health, environmental services, customer service, recreation, tourism, Hamilton Paramedic Service, transit planning and lodges, they've all had experiences slightly above or greater than the provincial average. I just want to point out this isn't just the maintenance budget, but this includes enhancements. So if I look at the last one is lodges, that stands out a bit. In 2000, and I believe it was 15 and 16, Council made enhancements towards the sustainability of lodges, $500,000 towards a reserve, towards the capital, as well as, and I believe that was in 2016, and then in 2015, an additional $250,000 annually in terms of, again, capital improvements. So again, this list doesn't just include the maintenance budget, but includes enhancements as well. So paramedic services, there were staffing enhancements of approximately $770,000 over this period. So that's reflected, that's a driving factor into paramedic services. Planning, there were some adjustments in terms of planning, continued to have historically some unfavorable variances. Council made some adjustments to the budget so it's more sustainable. And again, I'm just highlighting a number of these measures were to make these departments and services more sustainable. So I want to recognize Council for making those adjustments so that we deliver more sustainable budgets. And that represented about $760,000. Transit, Council approved the first 2 years of the 10-year transit strategy over this period. That was a contributing factor. And finally, housing, $825,000 to the rent subsidy program, and that's captured in this period as well. So again, just to provide you some additional information as to how the experience has differed across the various services over the last 5 years as it relates to budget changes. If we take this information and we now look at it a little differently, if we look at it in terms of departments, what we've done is over this period, the average levy increase would represent approximately $20 million. $20 million in additional funding to departments and boards and agencies on average annually over this period. If we look at the departments as to who's benefited principally in their services of that annual increase of approximately $20 million, you'll see for the most part it's been public works services that have been the recipients of those investments. Approximately 45% of the total increase over that 5-year period has been focused towards the services that Public Works supports. Boards and agencies, and that represents mainly police, is approximately 23%, community emergency services, 19%, and planning and all the other departments average approximately 7%. So just another way of presenting what we've experienced in terms of budget increases and where those investments have been targeted. In terms of the residential experience over the last 5 years, 10 years, the average residential increase over both the 5-year and 10-year period, City of Hamilton's been about 2%, and you can see that it's varied slightly higher in 2008, just short of 4%. Lower in 2011 and 12, and just you can see the breakdown again over the last 3 years. We've ranged from just above 2.5, 2.7% actual, down to about 1.7% in 2016, and finally 2017 again was 2.1%. So again, exclusive of inflation, average residential households in the City of Hamilton, both over the 5-year, 10-year period, would have experienced a 2% increase. If we net off inflation, if we adjust these increases for inflation, you're going to see that over that 10-year period, only 4 out of the 10 years did we have positive increases in residential tax impact. Positive in the sense that a greater than inflation. So again, in 2018 and 19, followed by 2013 and 2015. The balance of the years over that 10-year time series, the adjustments have been less than inflation. And so that's principally come out of work by staff and council towards our budget reductions. If I just remind ourselves of 2017, our experience through the 2017 budget process, we had approximately 85 positions that were eliminated, approximately $12 million in budget reductions that contributed to our final outcome in 2017. So those are the efforts that we've drawn upon in those years where the levy increase has been less than inflation. terms of 2017, what we were able to achieve in 2017 relative to our comparator groups, just highlighting once again that the City of Hamilton have the lowest of our comparator group residential tax increase. This is the municipal portion of the residential tax increase, the portion that you can control. You can't control the reassessment impact. So again, you'll recall that previously I spoke to a 2.1% impact, but the portion that you can control in terms of that impact is the residential levy increase, and that was 1.5% on average in 2017. And you can see relative to our comparator groups, that was a much more favorable outcome. If we look at what that contribution from our taxpayers goes towards, what investments those tax revenues are focused towards, you can see that city departments represent approximately 45% of average residential tax bill. Average residential tax bill is about $3,360. That's for a household assessed at $315,000. And you can see that in terms of that, the municipal portion, city departments represent approximately $1,770. I'll move over to capital, which again, council has control over. That represents our capital contribution towards all of our infrastructure, whether it's roads, bridges, rec centers, corporate facilities, lodges, housing. That represents approximately $270 annually for an average household in the City of Hamilton. Boards and agencies represents an additional approximately $810 annually. Education is clearly an area of the tax bill you have no control over, and that represents about $560 for an average household annually. And the other area you don't have absolute control over is our provincially shared programs, and that would be public health, paramedics, Hamilton Police Services, Ontario Works, housing, and that represents approximately an additional $500, $515 for an average household. So just to remind ourselves in terms of an average residential tax increase, where that funding is directed towards in terms of city departments, provincially shared programs, infrastructure, and boards, agencies, and finally education. And in terms of complement, I mentioned previously 2017, as part of the budget process, staff came forward and council approved a number of amendments. Those amendments reflected a net reduction of approximately 82 full-time equivalent positions. There was actually, I believe, 85 positions eliminated. Net of, there were 2 additional positions approved in Hamilton Police Services and a additional 0.7 for harm reduction in public health. So again, in 2017, there was a net reduction of approximately 82 positions. And you'll see on our tax-supported complement, the reduction in total complement in 2017 relative to 2015. And I just want to highlight that while that complement was achieved, it did not come at a cost of our services. We're continuing to provide the same programs and services, some variability in service levels, but again, we preserve both our programs and the services that the taxpayers rely upon. And just again, a bit of a reminder, this represents the breakdown of the departmental final 2017 levy requests, and you can see across a number of those of the departments there were actually negative levy increases in 2017. So consequently, there were levy reductions in a number of departments, and that was part of that budget reduction strategy that represented approximately $12 million in reductions, levy reductions, and you can see the breakdown in both planning, city manager, corporate services, and HECVI all having negative levy increases in 2017. So again, just some historical context in terms of the tax-supported budget. What have we experienced? How did we arrive at our final outcome in 2017? So I'm going to shift gears a bit here to the rate-supported budget side. On our rate-supported budget, the 3-year average water and wastewater combined increase was just short of 4.6%. It's ranged from 4.2 in 2015 to 4.85 in 2017. The average household experience as it relates to that increase would have experienced a increase of about $28. So $28 on average is the additional water and sewer fees they would have had to pay to continue to support the reliability of our water and wastewater services. If we look at our municipal comparators as it relates to our rate programs, you can see, again, we rank very favorably in terms of those increases relative to our comparators. Each and every year of this, of the period 2010 to 17, with, I believe, with no exception, sorry, each and every year the City of Hamilton has had a lower increase relative to our comparator group averages. And so while our comparator group averages have ranked from 4.3%, sorry, the 1 year was 2017, the average was 4.3 up to 6.8% each and every year over that time horizon. The City of Hamilton's increase has been below that average. So over that period, the City of Hamilton's average, overall average, was 4.3%, and our comparator group's average was 5.6%. I would say part of one of the factors that's contributed to the city's competitive position was some time ago, well over a decade ago, Council took a very strategic position towards investing into infrastructure and addressing that infrastructure deficit backlog in our water and wastewater program, and you can see some other municipalities are catching up with respect to that strategy, and they're still in the midst of making those investments. So that's contributed to Hamilton's competitive position as it relates to our rate-supported program. Again, I focused on the fact that Council made those investments to address our infrastructure, and if I look at the 2017 increase, you can see that a majority of the investment went towards infrastructure, towards capital financing. Total average household bill is approximately $660, and approximately just short of 60% of that, $380, goes towards the infrastructure required to support our water and wastewater program and our storm program to a certain degree as well. So again, very capital intensive, and you can see that in where our water and sewer fees are directed. It's towards the infrastructure required to deliver the service. The other supporting services represents approximately 40% of an average household's water and sewer bill, and that represents approximately $280. If we look at the net rate increases over the period 2015 to 17, again, the key message is the City of Hamilton is making investments, additional investments into infrastructure, water, wastewater infrastructure. Again, approximately 60% has gone towards capital financing, investments into our water plant, into our distribution system, into our wastewater plant, and into the collection system as well, and to a certain degree, storm as well. So again, the key message is that Hamilton is making efforts towards addressing its water, wastewater, and storm infrastructure requirements. The balance of the 3-year budget increase has been towards supporting the program and the delivery of program, and that represents about 40% of the budget increases. And in terms of the rate complement, you can see along with the introduction of some additional infrastructure, there's been the requirement for some additional human resources to support that infrastructure, and you can see over the period 2015 to 17, Council has supported some increases in complement, approximately 10 FTEs, just short of 10 FTEs, additional FTEs over that period 2017 versus 2015. Switching gears again, looking forward now. So again, some context in terms of what we've experienced, how we've arrived at our outcome for 2017. Now we're going to look forward a bit and give you a sense of what staff see in terms of 2018, some opportunities as well as some pressures, some headwinds as we approach 2018. Focusing on the tax operating budget, and I'll leave it up to, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll leave it up to committee whether they wish to ask questions at the end of the presentation, or given that that was some historical context, if this is a natural divide,
I only have two, so let's get those two out of the way, and or sorry, three, and then we'll get into this. Like we'll call this part two. So I have Councillor Marula, Councillor Green, and we'll begin with Councillor Vanderbeek.
Thanks. Mine will be short. My question's been answered. Thanks. You can take me off the list.
All right. Thank you, Councillor Vanderbeek. I have Councillor Marula, but first Councillor Green.
That messed me up. So going back to the chart that you had about the tax increases historically, I think it was a 10-year outlook, maybe. Nope. Broken down by department. There we go. So we know that we have a $200 million a year annual deficit in public works we're trying to catch up on. It's projected that that's going to continue to be a pressure in the foreseeable future, correct?
Yes, so through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the council is referring to the infrastructure deficit. The infrastructure deficit as a whole represents about $3.5 billion, and that will continue to be a pressure. You know, again, I'll just make reference to the Standard & Poor's independent review. They've identified that as a factor as to why council and this community has very average flexibility in terms of those future budget increases. Municipalities on average can defer a year or two, but overall you can't defer the requirements in terms of infrastructure investments. In order to continue to have safe and reliable services, you need to support the capital that's required. So again, and to the councillor's question, I know that was somewhat extended or long, is there's very little flexibility, and we will continue to see these pressures each and every year as it relates to the need to make investments in capital.
Which leads me to my next point, boards and agencies, mainly police. That seems to me to be one point that we could control, where we could look at reducing the costs of policing as crime rates go down, the costs continue to rise. So what are we anticipating? And I know this isn't, I'm not asking you to speak for future councils, but 23%, you know, over the last 4 years is substantial. And given that that is something that is controlled mostly in wages, correct?
Yeah. So if I focus on the slide prior to the departmental bubble chart, as you can see, police are reporting, it's hard to see on this line graph, but if I look at police on average over the last 3 years, their budget increase has been 3%, about 3% on average over the last 3 years. And to the councillor's point, as it relates to the first responders, whether it's police, paramedics, or fire, if I look at their budgets, about 85 to 90% of their budget is related to employee-related costs. So again, they're a service provider, heavily reliant on human resources, on staffing, and in terms of flexibility, the flexibility to achieve that final outcome is going to rely on changes to either how they deliver their services and the resources, human resources required to deliver those services. While there may be some flexibility in terms of capital deferring, that flexibility is short-term again. In terms of achieving changes relative to that average of 3%, to achieve something less than 3% is going to require some lower pressures, either through collective agreements or through the level of human resources required to support the service.
Well, I guess the challenge that I have is that when we talk about taxes, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and when we talk to the general public and we use percentages versus real terms, 3% of $160 million, or I should say 3% of 20% of our budget is substantial. And I caution us always reducing it to percentages, because on smaller line items, you know, we're comparing apples to forks. And so with this, you know, with this regard, this continued pressure, it's an average city department increase, and I'm sure it's probably an average rate across the province, because it is, as Councillor Marula points out time and time again, subject to provincial arbitration, where it seems like they always end up winning. And yet here we are, crime rates are going down across the province and costs for policing are going up. So I'm hopeful that the members of the board present or in the antechambers or wherever they are, Skyping in, however it works, take this to note that this pressure is something that's going to only increase, in my opinion, and its real costs in terms of its percentage are massive, 3% every year on top of 160. And it's compounded annually, every single year. And so my hope, Mr. Deputy Mayor, is that police services can look to modernize in a way that reduces some of those pressures where non-sworn officers are transferred over, or I should say, non-sworn duties are transferred over to citizens rather than sworn officers. Because if you were to look at this, if you were to look at the costs for overtime, if you were to look at the costs that they have in overtime in courts and everything else, paid duty, it is obscene where we're going with this. And I think if you were to ask the average citizen what they'd like to see in terms of investments in roads, in infrastructure, in our deficit that's there, versus ballooning police forces, I would wager that a lot of folks would be open to the idea of paying down some of our infrastructure deficits. So those are my comments. I'm keenly watching. 23% over 4 years is astounding, given the size of their budget and what that means in terms of real dollars. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I have Councillor Marule.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mike, just on a couple of things. I presume you're looking for a target today from this council, and in conversing with a number of colleagues, I think the 1.5 number is a good target. So at the appropriate time, I want to move that motion.
That'll come later.
Okay, so at the appropriate time. Secondly, with respect to the downloading file, just as an annual event, I need to highlight this issue. Can you just elaborate on the fact that we don't, as a council or a city, control half of our operating budget, and can you elaborate as to why?
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, if I use this pie chart to speak to Councillor Morla's question, if I look at city departments, so while council has principal control over city departments, some of our services are legislative regulated, but you principally have control over our city departments. The balance of the property tax bill, you have very little control. Capital financing, again, it's something that we control, but given our infrastructure deficit, we need to address that infrastructure deficit. Our other services, whether it is Ontario Works, housing, paramedics to a certain degree, Hamilton Police Services, fires is legislative regulated, boards and agencies, again, the conservation authorities, which we've had some challenges over the last few years in terms of controlling the Hamilton impact. Principally with Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, not to make that statement as it relates to the other conservation authorities. Council, again, does not have absolute control over those services. In fact, you really have your control principally is receiving a budget presentation and either approving it or referring it back to the board. But again, in terms of your authority and control, it's very limited to those services. So if we look at the Hamilton property taxpayer experience, and I apologize for being long again, but education represents about $560. Boards and agencies, an additional $811. So that's somewhere in the area, just short of $1,400 combined, and then provincial share programs, another $500. So you're now looking at $1,900 out of a total tax bill of about $3,900. That council does not have absolute control or an authority over.
Councillor Marule?
So through you, Mr. Chairman, so in essence, almost half of what we tax for, we don't control, yet the average person doesn't understand that. Something that I think we need to continually repeat, even though it's been an uphill battle trying to have people understand that.
Sorry to interrupt through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, but I think it's important as you deliberate and discuss a budget guideline, recognizing whether the guideline is 2% and 1.5%, is the experience of some of these services that you do not have control over, whether it's Hamilton Police or to a certain degree paramedics, fire, the lodges, housing, transit, which is being driven in part by provincial and federal mandates, is that guideline, that final outcome what I would suggest is being borne principally through the departments. So as those service areas continue to come in above average, above the guideline, what it drives is, what it drives is, these outcomes, where planning has had a negative levy reduction, where city manager, corporate services, even in some of our services such as public works at 1.3%. In order to offset some of those services that council doesn't have authority, it really compromises the services that you do have authority over. And so that's not going to continue to be sustainable. Achieving these outcomes will not be sustainable. It has to be a shared effort in terms of that budget guideline.
In a progressive manner rather than a regressive manner as to which it's presently been established. So through you, Mr. Chairman, the other component to this is the emergency services. So Councillor Green had alluded to the police and fire and EMS. And a few weeks ago, I asked you a question regarding the percentage of a budget, of operating budgets, versus the City of Hamilton versus emergency response, such as police, fire, and EMS. And you had answered about 85 to 90% is related to salaries, whereas the City of Hamilton is at what percentage?
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, about 85% of their budgets, 85 to 90% employee-related costs. If we look at the balance of the departments, it's probably in that 45 to 55% of our costs are related to the costs associated with employees.
Now, that is a staggering comparison. So just again, almost 90%, anything related to the province, they seem to be spending money like drunken sailors. Yet the City of Hamilton, very conservatively, we're at 45 to 50% when it comes to salaries. So that's, again, another thing or another issue that clearly the public has no grasp over, because they seem to blame us for everything from potholes to the Afghan war. But we need to really focus in on what the reality is. So lastly, any uptake whatsoever with respect to the downloading issue, and do you see anything in the future based on your discussions with them? It's because it seems like over the past few years that for every dollar they give us, they take $2 back, and it's been a seesaw type of endeavor for us. So do you see any positivity whatsoever in trying to get any net gain as it pertains to the percentage of which we have no control over with the province?
Right. So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I would suggest in the short term, I see no discussions occurring currently that would change that relationship in terms of that municipal-provincial relationship. I would suggest the one area, natural area, for some progression towards some dialogue. If you think back to the services that the provincial government has focused on, it's those services that municipalities don't have absolute control over, for instance, during a downturn, whether it's ODSP, Ontario Works, those social programs that should be born from a different revenue source, being principally income tax. That's a more fair source of funding those programs. I see the natural progression, the natural service would be housing. So in keeping with where they focus their efforts to date around those social programs, housing would be a natural extension in terms of a dialogue or discussion as it relates to changing that financial relationship between municipalities and the province. Okay.
And again, thanks very much, Mr. Chairman and Mike. And at the appropriate time, Mr. Chairman, if you want to come back to me for that motion, and it'll be seconded by Councillor Whitehead.
It's part of the second half presentation, so we'll get you at the end on that.
Sure. No
Remind me. Thank you. Good motion. And finally, on the first 17 pages, Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've raised this for a number of years, and I looked at Calgary and London, and principles that they adopt that frames the budget process to create some level of control. I've also raised, there's been a number of studies through the Chamber, Fraser Institute, a number of institutes that look at what's happening in municipalities in regards to the separation between public sector salaries versus private sector salaries basically do the same function. I've asked those comparisons for a reason. I need to understand what that separation is. We're creating haves and have-nots. If you're the public sector, you're a have, and if you're not, you're a have-not. And that's the type of separation that's taken. I think in some cases it's like 10, 15% differentials. So I'm trying to understand if we can look at better understanding what that separation is, because I don't think at some point you're going to have a revolt from everyone that works in the private sector trying to figure out why there's such a huge differential when they're doing the same work.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I know that Human Resources has compiled some of that information, and I expect as we come before committees looking for our mandate going into 2018, 2019, that would be content that we would bring back to this committee before you form some direction as it relates to that collective bargaining mandate.
And I appreciate, because I think, and I hope that we do this right across Ontario, but I think what we need to start doing is ensuring that, balanced society is about ensuring that what they say, a high tide raises all ships. There's a group being left behind, and that's many people working in the private sector. So it concerns me that we don't, in some way or some matter, or at least have a dialogue about whether that should somehow be a reference point. And I'm not suggesting it's a drive to the lowest common denominator. I'm not suggesting that at all. But it doesn't mean it's excluded from the conversation in regards to principles that we can adopt here on a go-forward basis. So that information would be invaluable to help formulate that dialogue.
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, again, we'll convey that direction to Human Resources. I know that, I've been privy to the information data as it relates to some services where there are comparators, whether it's in the finance area, in the IT area. It's hard to compare with, for instance, transit, fire, paramedics. Those are public services that the private sector doesn't necessarily participate in. So again, we will convey the message to HR, and the appropriate time may be as we come forward seeking a mandate for the next collective bargaining process is to have that information as part of the context leading into your deliberations and discussion.
Appreciate that. And I think the last comment or question or comment, I wouldn't mind a comment from you, is my understanding, because we've had a number of arbitration cases with the police, and affordability didn't wash, although I think the problem is, are they not trying to do something to put a little more pressure on the arbitration system to recognize affordability in municipalities? Has there been any changes or dialogue or discussion that you're aware of at your level?
Yeah. So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, in terms of treasurers, we're principally seeing the outcome. We aren't seeing any significant changes in terms of the direction that those arbitrated decisions are landing in terms of increases. I don't know if Nicole or others are more familiar with any legislated or regulatory changes, but in terms of outcomes, we're seeing, maybe while there continue to be pressures, some slight relief in terms of the size of those pressures, but overall those arbitrated decisions still continue to be over and above what we're seeing on average with our other services.
So one of the arguments that be made by many associations is that it's not inflating the salary cost in paramedics, policing, fire, and so forth, but yet the reality seems to show something different with the examples you cited here. I'm a believer that there's always been an argument that there's a lack of data to evidentially make that case. Are we now at the point, based on the disproportionate pressure on our operations through the balance of the city when we're trying to hit targets, are we at the point now that we can add to that case made to the province of Ontario and how disproportionately these salaries are rising faster than any other area within the city of Hamilton?
Yeah. So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I think collectively across the province, municipalities have been identifying, and I know there's been some resolutions from council to the province to look at that whole arbitration process. in terms of how they've contributed to some of the challenges that councils have had as it relates to tax competitiveness. So again, this council has put forward resolutions in the past, and I believe other councils have as well, asking the province to review that process.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
Councillor Green, second time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and certainly Councillor Whitehead raises some important points. I do want to, though, make sure that we create and draw very clear distinctions around public sector versus private sector compensation. Certainly, the workers that are public sector workers, typically good union-paying jobs, protected rights, protected salaries. Mr. Deputy Mayor, what we've seen in the private sector is decades of wage suppression and profits directed to shareholders and corporate CEOs. The income inequality that's happening in North America is massive. And, you know, I raise this point. I'm seeing some people throw their arms up in the air, because if we start to anchor our workers' salaries to the private sector, and we say that we should be targeting the lowest of the low, then we're on a slippery slope. So I just want to make that distinction, that we don't make the comparison between public sector and private sector workers when we know private sector workers have had wage suppressions for the last 3 decades, and all the money is going to the top. So that doesn't happen in government. Government is not business. Government is not corporation. Government is a service to the people. I just want to make that clear. Thank you.
Thank you. And onward and upward. Slide your second half of your presentation, Mike, please.
Great. So now, in balance of the presentation is going to focus on 2018 and looking forward. So in terms of 2018, and I'll start with the tax-supported operating budget, staff are currently identifying a potential residential tax pressure about 4.8%. And that 4.8% would represent approximately just short of $44 million in additional levy funding. And I'll take you through a breakdown of the cost categories as it relates to that pressure and the factors that are affecting that potential risk or pressure. In terms of, we've just spent the last few minutes talking about employee-related costs, salary and wages. So in terms of that overall just short of $44 million, about $14 million represents employee-related cost pressures. And this is pressures as it relates to our collective agreements, pressures as well as it relates to government benefits, health benefits, employer benefits, and I'll break that down in a few slides. But again, that represents, out of the $44 million, approximately $14 million is employee-related costs. Operating costs as it relates to capital. So as the city has introduced new infrastructure or a higher level of investment in infrastructure, that infrastructure sometimes drives associated operating costs. And so what we're identifying as it relates, and these aren't, just to remind council, these wouldn't be typically 2018 capital projects that will come before you in December, but these are capital projects that would have been approved in either in 2017, 16, 15. So as those assets come into service, there are costs associated with maintaining those assets, either energy costs, additional, in some limited cases, additional complement. And so the one example I would use is transit, as we make investments into additional vehicles, additional service hours, additional routes, that requires operators and maintenance and support staff. So again, operating, the impact of prior capital projects represents an additional $2.3 million. If we look at all of the other services across the City of Hamilton, we've bundled those together, and I'll break it down in a few slides. That represents $6.2 million. And in terms of, corporate-wide would be inflationary pressures, whether it's our waste collection, inflationary adjustments, winter control, inflationary adjustments, that's reflected as corporate-wide. City departments represent additional $7.8 million in pressures. Boards and agencies, we've made some assumptions as it relates to Hamilton Police Services based on historical experience, would represent $5.7 million. Our capital, we're reflecting a 7.5, and I'll take one just a minute to break down capital. The 7.5 is reflective of what was before you in 2017, a bit different from what's been before you in previous years. The 7.5 represents the traditional capital levy increase, recommended increase of 0.5%, and that represents just over $4 million. And the balance represents the city's contribution towards the agreement we've entered into with the federal and provincial governments with respect to public transit. The Public Transit Infrastructure Fund, the city was able to leverage a matching grant of $36 million. The city is required to finance its $36 million contribution. You'll recall it's $72 million in whole, 36 local, 36 federal, and that $36 million will drive some additional debt financing requirements. That debt financing represents somewhere in the area of $3.5 million. So I just wanted to highlight the difference in terms of the capital pressure, a higher level of capital required for 2018 than you may recall seeing in prior years, such as 15 and 16. So again, the overall pressure or risk is just short of $44 million, 4.8%. So for an average household, again, at that $315,000 assessed value, if council were to approve a 4.8% municipal levy increase, their experience would represent approximately $160. That would be an additional pressure for that average household of $160. And what we've done is we tried to break that down in terms of the city departments, boards and agencies, capital financing, and again, that PTIF is that Public Transit Infrastructure Fund, that additional $36 million in transit infrastructure. That would drive that additional $14 million pressure in 2018. So again, 4.8% would represent approximately $160,000. Exclusive of the PTIF, it would be 4.4% at just short of $150 million. So again, just in terms of percentages, I know that Councillor Green made reference to percentages, dollar terms. We're just identifying what the dollar impact would be to an average household. If I take a few minutes now and break down those cost categories, just to give you some more information and sense as to what's driving some of these pressures. Again, if I look at the employee-related costs, you'll recall it was approximately $14 million in total. If we break it down, if we look at our collective agreements and settlements, that represents about $9 million of the $14 million. So these are agreements that we have entered into, and again, it's principally our collective agreements and the settlements, and so our flexibility is very limited in terms of controlling that, and that represents about $9 million. Merit increases, as people mature and develop in the organization, they're entitled to merit increases until such time as they've achieved the maximum in their salary range. What we're identifying is that would represent additional $1.6 million in pressures. OMERS, there's no proposed change in the percentage contribution for OMERS. This is just as people experience higher salaries and wages due to collective bargaining settlements, or as it relates to their merit increases or their maturity in the organization, that drives our contribution towards OMERS. So OMERS is $1.3 million in terms of the employer contribution. Government benefits, approximately $200,000. Employer benefits, approximately $100,000. And I'm going to pause here and speak a bit to the fire line of duty benefit. So the fire line of duty benefit is a change that the province made with respect to presumptive illnesses. So as the province has expanded the list of illnesses that firefighters could claim compensation as it relates to, for instance, if a firefighter is diagnosed with melanoma, they can now have that recognized as an illness as it relates to the service that they provided. So this was a legislative change that the province had made, and they've expanded that list of presumptive illnesses. And this is an experience not unique just to the City of Hamilton. This is an experience that other municipalities across the province, again, they are experiencing, a change that they are experiencing. So that change, that legislative change, is driving local financial pressures, and in the case of the City of Hamilton, that change represents approximately $600,000 in pressures. And again, as the list of illnesses expands, that's going to create even further local pressures in future years. So again, it's principally driven by that list of presumptive illnesses. WSIB contributions, that represents an additional $400,000. It's something that we need to monitor, the WSIB potential pressures going forward as the province looks at the legislation around fair wage. It could be some migration of some claims from our health benefit provider to WSIB. And I just highlight it, if you look at health benefit providers across municipalities, our administrative costs are somewhere in the area of 7%, 9%. If we look at WSIB, their administrative costs are probably in that 32 to 35% range. And so we need to be very mindful if that legislation drives a transition of administering benefits from our health providers over to SIB, we may bear a higher administrative cost or burden as it relates to those WSIB costs. Minimum wage, what we're identifying is the proposed minimum wage, the changes in the minimum wage, and I know it's at a consultation process. Currently, that progression to $14 in 2018, $15 in 2019. For 2018, we're identifying that pressure at approximately $600,000. It's not just a reminder, it's not just those recipients that would drive that pressure, but because of compression, if you have a employee who's going to progress up to $15 and there's a supervisor earning $14.90, that progression of that employee will drive an increase in the supervisor's compensation because of compression. So there needs to be a gap between those two positions. So overall, what we're identifying is a potential risk of $600,000. And finally, retiree benefits is an additional pressure of approximately $500,000. So in total, that provides committee some sense as the factors that are contributing to that overall $14 million in pressures. Moving on, I spoke to the operating impacts of capital projects. Again, these are projects that were approved either as part of the 17 capital budget process or prior years, and the total is $2.3 million, and you can see the breakdown as it relates to 2016 and prior years of $1 million and $1.3 million. I spoke to the capital being slightly different this year, a traditional capital levy pressure. Staff are recommending 0.5%. That would generate additional $4.1 million. That would be additional funding that traditionally has gone into whether it's lodges, waterfront, roads, bridges, traffic, housing, those traditional services and programs often referred to as our blocks, our capital blocks. The local contribution to that $72 million investment in public transit that's already been approved by Council. Our local matching contributions, $36 million. We will be debt financing that $36 million, so there's an annual financing cost and annual mortgage costs, and that represents approximately $3.4 million annually, and that would drive a capital financing increase of an additional 0.41. So again, traditional 0.5%, but because of Council's commitment towards the transit program through PTIF, that additional investment drives additional 0.41 for a total of 0.91. So again, the capital levy, recommended capital levy increase for 2018 is 0.91. Inflationary, and again, this is principally, contractual requirements or inflationary requirements are driving the corporate impact, and that is approximately $7.2 million. You'll see in the recommendations to the report before you, staff are recommending a 2% user fee increase. Council has previously pegged that increase to CPI. CPI for 2017, June 2016 to June 2017 was in that 1.3% range, and so staff are recommending a 2% increase as it relates to user fees, excluding transit, ice, and golf. Those typically come before you as standalone reports. That 2% increase, and on average it's a 2%, but departments will identify user fee increases potentially greater or less than 2%, depending on circumstances, whether it's market circumstances or just the utilization of the service. If approved, that 2% guideline would generate approximately $2.8 million in additional revenue. That would reduce the levy, potential levy impact. So again, 2% user fee guideline would represent approximately $2.8 million in annual user fee revenues. Energy, natural gas, electricity, we're identifying a pressure of $1.7 million. And for your benefit, we've broken it down in terms of natural gas, electricity, and fuel. And you'll see the principal driver of the $1.7 million in 2018 is electricity. 1.3 million out of the $1.7 million pressure is electricity. That's a similar experience in 2017. We had a pressure of about $2.7 million as it relates to electricity. So staff through Public Works in the Energy Office are working towards ways of mitigating these energy pressures, either through conservation efforts or through hedging purchasing of natural gas, when the market is soft or favorable in terms of purchasing. That's a strategy that we've leveraged and employed in the past to try to manage our natural gas costs. And you can see that we aren't forecasting pressures in 2018 as it relates to natural gas, but we are forecasting, and it's principally electricity and to a lesser degree the fuel. Again, we'll come back as part of the 2018 budget deliberations as it relates to fuel. We see a lot of variability in terms of diesel and unleaded, and so there may be opportunities going forward as it relates to those pressures, but currently we're showing a potential pressure of approximately $400,000 in 2018. In terms of the city departments, we've broken it down by department to give you a better sense as to what we see ahead in 2018, both in opportunities, and the first one is an opportunity. It's the final year of the upload of Ontario Works Employment Income Support. That represents a $3.2 million benefit to local taxpayers. Housing, and this is principally driven by the benchmark, the provincial regulation as it relates to inflationary adjustments for housing providers. That represents $1.9 million. So these are just not new units. These are the inflationary adjustments that housing providers are entitled to under provincial legislation and regulation. Housing, there are some housing mortgages that are being retired. The retiring of some of those housing mortgages represents a savings of approximately $200,000. What's offsetting that is some loss in federal funding, and whatever we achieve in terms of a property tax increase in 2018, that will be a pressure for housing providers. They do contribute towards property taxes with the exception of City Housing Hamilton. We've deemed those now municipal capital facilities. They no longer pay property taxes, but the other housing providers pay property taxes, and that is an eligible cost for reimbursement, and so that represents a pressure of approximately $1.1 million. So in terms of community services, you can see that subtotal represents approximately a $400,000 reduction, principally driven by the final year of the Ontario Works income and benefit upload. Public Works increased contribution into our fleet vehicle reserve to improve sustainability. As well, we're seeing some pressures as it relates to some outside services as it relates to fleet management, and we're identifying preliminary pressure of approximately $1 million. We've had, committee has heard over the last few months some discussion around transit, the transit experience and what was budgeted for revenues versus achieved revenues. And I know a report is before AFNA Wednesday of this week with some additional information, but we're identifying approximately $990,000 in pressures in 2018 to better reflect what the actual experience is as it relates to ridership and the revenues associated with that ridership. So again, having higher than budgeted ridership is creating a unfavorable variance in 2017. To correct for that in 2018 would represent a pressure just short of $1 million. The third year of the 10-year transit strategy would represent an additional $2.5 million. You'll recall as part of 2017, we weren't in a position to move forward with the third year because we were subject to those projects that were ultimately approved through the Public Transit Infrastructure Fund. So given that the federal government could not commit in a timely manner prior to the approval of the budget, that was deferred to 2018, and that would represent an additional $2.5 million. The operating costs associated with those $72 million in infrastructure investments, there are some additional vehicles, there's some maintenance officers' costs associated with those projects. They represent just short of $300,000 in pressures. Again, as we increase the fleet, or as the makeup of the fleet changes to ensure that those vehicles are sustainable going forward, we review the reserve annually, and staff are identifying some pressures in the transit reserve, and those pressures would require an adjustment of approximately $450,000. And again, the issue with respect to the transition to the new agreement as it relates to Presto, the funding agreement that's been before committee in the past, that transition in terms of the Presto funding agreement would represent an additional pressure about $350,000. The final pressure is related to DARTs, and that pressure is broken down. While the total is $1.7 million, about $1 million of that $1.7 million reflects additional ridership. So as they forecast a higher level of participation and additional ridership, that's going to contribute to the contractual commitments to DARTs from the corporation. And that, again, represents about $1 million of the $1.7 million. And the balance is just short of $700,000 is the inflationary costs with respect to existing ridership. So as their inflationary costs increase, it allows them to recover some of their costs, whether it's fuel, employee-related costs, and that, again, represents approximately $700,000. So in terms of public works, we're forecasting pressures in 2018 of just short of $7.3 million. Some of our other corporate services are risk premiums, and we'll have some additional information in terms of what specifically is driving the risk premiums. But I can tell you in terms of the services or the areas that we're seeing higher activity, it's sidewalk and road claims, fleet services, and transit, and finally police. Those four service areas, we're seeing higher claims. That drives our costs as it relates to risk management costs. So again, we will report back as part of our 18 budget with some additional information as it relates again to sidewalk and road claims, fleet services, transit, and finally police. Boards and agencies, as it relates to police, we've simply used an average. I mentioned previously the average for Hamilton Police Services over the last 3 to 5 years has been 3%, so we've reflected that 3%. We don't have specific information as to what they're forecasting. So again, we put a placeholder in place at 3%. That would represent $4.8 million. Our other boards agencies, conservation authorities is approximately $0.3 million, exclusive of the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority appeal. That would represent an additional pressure if the city didn't realize a favorable outcome to that appeal. Library at 2% would represent $0.6 million, and our City of Richmond Fund, our granting program at 2% would represent an additional $100,000 in pressures. So boards and agencies, a number of assumptions, but based on those assumptions, the impact in 2018 would be $5.7 million. Over and above the just short of $44 million. We just want to identify some other areas that we need to continue to monitor, whether it's our revenues as it relates to transit or golf fees, again, something that we need to monitor as part of the balance of 2017 leading into 2018. Assessment appeals, you've heard me speak previously to assessment appeals. If those property owners are successful as it relates to those appeals, not only does it affect 2017, but it could drive a potential budget pressure into 2018. Contractual pressures are collective bargaining agreements. 2018, we have some sense. There are some areas that still we don't know what the final outcomes as they're still in that process, either bargaining or arbitration. And so again, for the most part, we know what we're facing in 2018. It will be beyond 2018 that will be before committee to seek a mandate going beyond 2018. Environmental risks, we already know of a number of challenges as it relates to environmental factors, whether they're storm events, whether it's around escarpment roads, whether they're stormwater events. Those continue to be areas that we need to monitor and report back to committee. And again, we've identified that as something to again monitor, and if we see continued pressures, is to make some adjustments going forward to the budget to ensure that we're providing that appropriate level of funding to address some of those challenges. I mentioned the MPCA appeal, and as it relates to water, we would expect this given the pattern we've experienced this year in 2017, as we've had higher than average rainfall, and it's been variable rainfall. So it's resulted in people utilizing water for outside watering to a lesser extent. They've relied on Mother Nature. That has an impact not only on our water sales, but also has an impact on our wastewater collection. So all that storm water that makes its way into the system has to be treated, and so that has an associated cost. So Mother Nature sometimes can have impacts in terms of our water wastewater programs. Last year was a dry year, it was favorable. 2017, we're seeing a different experience as it relates principally due to rainfall. So with respect to the report that's before you, staff are recommending that the user fees guideline be set at 2% for 2018, excluding golf fees, transit fares, and ice rental fees. We ask for a guideline from City Council for the 2018 operating budget as it relates to the boards and agencies. We similarly ask for a guideline for 2018 tax operating budget for city departments. So a guideline for city departments, a guideline for boards and agencies, that the traditional operating budget guideline for capital of 0.5%, staff are recommending the 0.5%, and above the 0.5% is the 0.41% as it relates to the public transit infrastructure fund. So just in terms of where we stand today, again, just short of $44 million in pressures. If the guideline were to be 2%, that would require staff coming before council with potential reductions in the area of $22 million. So again, a 2% guideline would require $22 million in reductions, and we would have to work with council on a process on how to bring those potential reductions, amendments to services, programs, service levels before you for your consideration. A 1% guideline would represent approximately $13.3 million in additional funding. That would leave a gap relative to the 43.7 of about $30 million. So again, a 1% guideline would represent approximately $30 million in reductions or service level adjustments, service adjustments that we would have to come forward to council for discussion as part of the 2018 tax supported budget process. And in terms of what 1% represents, a 1% increase represents $8.2 million in additional revenues. I should point out, I'm not sure if it's in a slide going forward, or maybe I skipped over it. In terms of assessment growth represents an opportunity, a benefit to us. We're assuming 1% assessment growth. You'll recall it varies from year to year. 2017 was lower than our historical experience. It was 0.7. On average, we've ranged from 0.8 to 1.6. So if there, again, we're assuming 1% assessment growth. If there's assessment growth over and above that 1%, that will help reduce that levy pressure of just short of $44 million. But again, 1% represents $8.2 million in additional municipal tax revenue. In terms of the rate budget outlook, staff are recommending a 4.5% increase. And again, you can see I spoke previously to that theme of investing in infrastructure capital. Of that 4.5%, the majority, 3.7%, would go towards capital investments, infrastructure investments. 0.8% is related to the programs to support the service, water service and wastewater service. So again, 4.5% for an average household in the city of Hamilton would represent a $30 increase in their total annual water and wastewater bill. So the recommended rate increase, staff are recommending that the combined rate increase for 2018 be 4.5%. And then finally, in terms of budget schedule, you have the budget schedule before you for approval, and subject to your approval of the budget schedule, I know that Stephanie has been working towards setting those dates aside they're already set aside for GIC dates, so again, they should be part of your calendar. I just want to identify one potential change we're recommending for 2018 is given all of the discussion around transit. You'll recall that transit previously would have been part of the deliberations in January or February. We're suggesting that we accelerate those discussions in November to allow staff to compile the information that may be required to allow you the time to digest that information, to allow you to make informed decisions as it relates to the budget deliberation. So what we are proposing is that our budget day be moved up from traditionally the start of the new year into 2017 to allow staff some additional time to make those decisions. And Stephanie's identified that it is already in your calendar. So again, that's reflected in our schedule. So again, finally, the budget schedule is before you for approval today as well. So again, in terms of the recommendations, it's the departmental operating budget guideline, it's the boards of agencies guideline, it's the user fees, it's our capital financing, the rate budget guideline, and finally, the budget schedule that we're asking for approval. And through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that's the end of my presentation, I believe. Nope, it isn't, sorry. We have some final update slides in terms of the multi-year business plans and budgets. So as a reminder, 2018 starts the official, represents official start to multi-year budgeting. And so we'll be focused more on not simply the upcoming year, but a more detailed discussion on a 4-year horizon as it relates to our budgets. And to complement that is the development of formal business plans. And so you'll have some additional information that will help inform you through your deliberations. So multi-year business plans and budget process has been approved by the subcommittee and council. Staff are working towards the implementation of multi-year budgeting and the development of those business plans. Again, those plans will form part of the communication through the budget process, and again, they'll be linked to council's strategic priorities in the plan, and you'll receive information, not only descriptive information, but financial information as it relates to what staff are foreseeing as it relates to opportunities and pressures, not only in 2018, but for the next 4 years. So again, that represents a change in the 2018 budget process, and again, we've incorporated that into the budget schedule and into the information that will be brought before you as part of the 2018 budget process for both tax and the rate budget process. And I believe Hamilton Police Services Board has also endorsed the multi-year budgeting process, and I believe Library Services Board as well. So again, you'll receive some consistency in information, not only from city departments, but boards and agencies as well. And that represents the end of today's presentation.
Thanks,
I'd be
Mike.
happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Looks like our clerk wants to get on the same page with you.
Just for clarification, the budget dates are before you for information only, not for approval?
Yeah. Ooh, thought it was for...
No, Mike was saying for approval, so I just wanted you to know they're already
Okay.
set. and
Thank
form's
you for
already
the
been
clarification. We are going to modify A and B, Part A and Part B, and I think Councillor Marula will move those accordingly with Whitehead seconding. I have a speaker's list of Councillor Whitehead, but first Councillor Green. Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you. Mike, what I didn't see a lot of in the presentation, and I think even Councillor Ferguson has raised it, and I think he's been spot on. And that is, we've made a lot of efforts in two areas. One is revenue generation, and two is efficiency and energy savings. I know, for example, my area, I still don't have LED lighting in our street lamps, so obviously there's going to be projected savings over time as those projects are implemented. So how do we capture, or have you captured, because every time we seem to find savings, it just gets sort of absorbed very quickly in the process. So help me understand on the revenue side how we're doing. Help me understand on the energy side how we're doing in actual numbers.
Right. So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that's a great question. Two service areas that have helped us not only in 2017, but previous years, either to alleviate our levy pressure, but in some cases to make some enhancements. That revenue, the revenue that's been generated by the revenue generation division has helped to fund some enhancements that council has approved in 2017 prior years. I would suggest that it's not currently in that forecast. I know if I look at our 2017 variance report, we are favorable relative to what we had forecasted from the revenue generation group. So it would mitigate that $4.4 million pressure. To what degree? I'm not sure if it's a $600,000 or $400,000 level of relief. I would suggest maybe somewhere in that range, but that will come before you as part of our 2018 budget deliberations. On the work in terms of whether it's through LED as it relates to electricity, whether it's natural gas hedging, we've made some assumptions, and that's reflected in those pressures, the 1.3 and the 0.4%. What we don't have absolute control over, so if I focus principally on the electricity, what we don't have absolute control over is the regulatory environment that we work under. So exclusive of some of those efforts, there continue to be some challenges for consumers such as the City of Hamilton. So while we as homeowners hear of relief as it relates to electricity, homeowners or small commercial, all rate classes aren't experiencing that same relief as part of the changes that the province of Ontario has enacted. So as a result, city staff look to other ways of structuring our energy profile to provide some relief, principally around large facilities like the water treatment plant, wastewater treatment plant. So again, my message to you would be, don't assume that the relief that's being provided to small businesses and residential households will be shared with institutional or large users such as ourselves. So consequently, we're forecasting a pressure of about $1.3 million, and again, staff will speak as part of the 2018, will present as part of their departmental presentations how we're trying to address those pressures and mitigate some of those pressures. Natural gas, we hedge natural gas well in advance. We typically do that in a shoulder season. Spring, fall, that's a good time to purchase natural gas, and so staff are reflecting no increase in natural gas in terms of budget increases for 2018, and the final would be fuel. We've made some assumptions based on where we are with respect to unleaded and diesel. What we would hope is if there's some stability in the geopolitical environment is that fuel will stay where the prices are today. If they were to stay at the prices they are at today, we may be able to reduce that $400,000 pressure slightly. But given the geopolitical unrest right now, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how that's going to affect fuel prices for the balance of 2017 and 18.
Appreciate. Help me understand in your presentation, for example, economic development. We've taken some lofty targets, if I recall, to try and reach. And of course, when you generate new employment, new tax bases, that impacts the overall assessment. How are we incorporating, how are we doing, and what is the variance between what we targeted annually versus what we're actually receiving?
Sure. And so through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'll speak to assessment, and I'm not sure if Glenn wants to complement that with respect to any other indicators that he might have on hand. I'll just remind committee in terms of what our previous historical experience has been with assessment. We've ranged from 0.8% assessment growth to 1.6. The best year we had was 1.6. You'll recall 2017, this year, is we experienced 0.7% assessment growth. We think that 0.7 in part would have been affected with the reassessment period. So as MPAC goes through a reassessment period, it needs to direct some resources to address that 4-year reassessment cycle, as well as some retirements in terms of the local MPAC office. What we suspect, and I have a meeting with senior MPAC representatives in, I believe it's October, is, and we're seeing some favorable assessment rolls, preliminary rolls. What I expect is there may be slight catch-up in terms of 2018 because of our experience in 2017. So what's before you today in terms of assessment growth, we've made an assumption of 1%. Anything over and above that 1% would further mitigate that $44 million pressure. So again, I hope that potentially prior to the end of this calendar year, but definitely as part of the 2018 budget presentation, I'll have some additional information as to what we might expect in 2018 as it relates to assessment growth. So again, we're assuming 1%.
And on housing starts, with the changing legislation and some cooling off, as cyclical, there's risk and reward. So the question is, how we contemplated in that, I guess, that 1% assessment, because I imagine you're taking residential in that too, is that correct?
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the councilor's correct. So in terms of any potential dampening in resale and new housing, it's reflected in that 1%. I think it's still somewhat early. I think there's clearly been a reaction in terms of the legislative changes. The question is whether there'll be some adjustment back. The consensus from the financial institutional sector is they're forecasting some continued growth, but more realistic or stable growth, not the level of pricing escalation that we've seen in the past. So something more traditional, historical, that 2% level rather than the 28%.
Now, help me understand, there's more condo, multi-dwellings being constructed in the last number of years. In my ward, there's 2 or 3 proposed or under development. I know that that's happening in other areas, certainly in the lower city. I was always told when you put it in a multi-dwelling that you're getting actual better return in regard to the taxes to the city. Is that correct?
Yeah. So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that would be the case with the exception that the City of Hamilton, as well as other municipal jurisdictions, in order to help to facilitate that form of development, we adopted some years ago a new multi-res class. So anyone who's developing a new multi-res, their ratio was pegged to the residential. So one for one. instead of the 1.78 that the traditional form of multi-residential would have been. So in order to help facilitate that, Council approved a tax rate equal to residential, so less than what historically multi-residential developers would have experienced. So that was a way to incent that form of development.
So if I get a 10-story building, would the city not be experiencing a pretty significant tax roll from that 10-story building?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, absolutely. And so I expect what we report in 2018 will capture some of the downtown. We're going to see some change in terms of where we're realizing that assessment growth, and it'll be the prior Revenue Canada facility that's now occupied. So we're going to start seeing that captured into the assessment roll. I'm just identifying that new multi-res does not contribute to the same degree as multi-res developed prior to the adoption of that new resident multi-res property tax class. So it was just a form of council to incent multi-res development.
I understand that. I think the business case in regards to a 10-story building and what it contributes, and I'm not going to get into the land use issues, from a business case, is that it would contribute significantly more dollars into the city coffers than single-family homes.
Yeah. And I would, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and I would simply add that the province now regulates intensification, and so our planning and economic development department work towards those targets, and there are some aggressive targets up to 60% in certain corridors.
Now, the last line of questioning is on the risk that I didn't see really clearly identified here. Currently, through what I call a flawed process in places to grow, and the formulas that they use to calculate employment and growth, and it's not just me saying it, it's AMO saying it, who's meeting actually this week. The question I have is that we are making investments based on what I call faulty formula. We're building based on that formula. We're making those investments hoping that we recover a percentage through development charges. My understanding is most municipalities are not recovering the amount of development charges for the capital that they're laying out, which exposes the taxpayers in those communities, including the City of Hamilton. I haven't seen that risk identified here.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, another great question, but in terms of how we budget versus how we plan council, and you've been very conscious of this going back to 2008, 2009, and thankfully so, because we entered the recession at the same time as we were having the discussions with respect to what was forecast as it relates to growth and versus the actual experience, and how that actual experience, different from forecast, represented inflationary or non-inflationary, a financial risk to us. So how we've differed, and I expect municipality to municipality will take different strategies. Our strategy as it relates to places to grow is we budget according to our actual experience, recognizing that at the end of 2031, we have to reconcile to places to grow in terms of our actual servicing that's required to help to facilitate growth. So from a budget perspective, if you were to look at our budget documents, and we identified this in our budget documents for the benefit of the public and investors as well, including Standard & Poor's, is we've back-ended a number of those infrastructure investments so that we minimize the risk of having abandoned assets or assets that we've prematurely brought into service. The risk will become, as we approach 2031, and then as potentially the province expands that horizon to 2041, as you approach that tail end of that period, there needs to be some realignment of budget relative to your planning documents. So how we differ? Absolutely. Planning adheres to the legislation. They plan out to 2031. Potentially we'll have to plan out to 2041. Financially, what we budget for is our actual experience, because we are concerned, as the councillors identified, City of Hamilton, other jurisdictions aren't seeing the same employment per hectare and density per hectare that the province is forecasting.
And I appreciate that. And I guess I'm trying to fathom that in the last 10 years, with record-breaking reports in respect to assessment, or not assessment, building permits, over $1 billion, hot housing market, which may slow down. There's already signs of that. We grew 32,000. We're building and planning for 130,000 for 2031, 150,000 for 2031, the next 10 years. It's hard to fathom. We grew 32,000 in the last 10 years with a very robust development. How we would attain 150,000 in the next 10 years, which would inevitably have a significant impact on planning, infrastructure, capital expenditures, et cetera. You're indicating that we're doing it based on experience. So I guess it flushes out the question: what experience are we actually basing it on? Is it based on that 32,000 I just talked about?
Yes. So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and we bring that information forward to you through the budget deliberations because it's important, important data and information as it relates to committee's appreciation on how we budget versus how we plan. If we look at the past 10 years, we might see single-family equivalent housing development maybe in that range of 1,700 to 2,200, maybe slightly higher than 2,200 at the top end, versus places to grow that would have projected 3,500 annually. And so we plan towards, or we budget according to our actual experience, that's 1,700 to 2,200. But planning adheres to the places of grow legislation in terms of accommodating that future population and employment. So our planning documents absolutely align. What I'm identifying is that the risk is really in the tail end of that time horizon. At some point, there will be a point in time where we come before you and identify we are potentially 80,000 short of what the province projected in terms of population. Our density maybe doesn't align to what the province had assumed, and finally that the population growth hasn't materialized according to what the province has forecasted. We're not quite there yet. We're managing that risk through budgeting according to actual versus what's forecast. But at some time leading into 2031, well in advance of 2031, that's a conversation that I expect we will have. And I know the province is having some consideration with respect to those forecasts. I know there are discussions with municipalities regarding the difference between forecast and actual experience, and that may lead into some adjustments in terms of those forecasts by the province.
So, and the reason I'm asking the question, because my understanding, we're already making significant investments based on growth in certain areas of the city with oversized piping and so forth, or pumping and so forth on the mountain. Frida, which is arguably in or out, but certainly at some point contemplated to be in, and 20 Road, that we had oversized pipes to meet that growing need. So we are making those investments.
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we are, but we're doing it in a strategic way. So you'll recall planning making reference to their staging a development report. And so whatever financial resources are available to us, they're targeted to those areas that we could proceed with the infrastructure investments. We don't blindly proceed with the infrastructure investment. Frankly, we haven't the financial capacity to do so. And so there's an alignment between the staging a development report with our financial position, and so that creates a natural constraint in terms of the discussions with respect to where will we grow. Where will we grow will be subject to the pace of development and how much revenue we realize from development charges, and that will help to inform Tony and Jason as it relates to the staging of development and what development could proceed and what development what development may have to be patient and await for the collection of revenues to help to facilitate.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Councillor Ferguson.
I think Councillor Whitehead's asked most of my questions around the assessment, and surely we've hit the bottom now with the reassessment appeals of the commercial industrial sector. So do you agree we're at the end, particularly when we paid the kind of money per acre we did for the expansion to the Lister block? That's got to be a signal of how much property values have increased in the lower city.
Yeah. So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that's a great differentiation the councillors identified, and I apologize I didn't separate assessment appeals from assessment growth. I think I would expect to see a more favorable outcome in terms of what I report for assessment growth in 2018 versus 2017. Where we're going to continue to face some challenges will be principally in that commercial sector as it relates to assessment growth. So the most recent minutes of settlement was related to Home Depot. Home Depot, across the province of Ontario, municipalities have seen a reduction in the assessed value and tax contribution of Home Depot. We're going to see similar patterns, whether it's Home Depot, whether it's Walmart, whether it's Shoppers Drug Mart. That sector continues to aggressively challenge their assessed value, and that's going to represent a challenge not only for City of Hamilton but municipalities across the province. And it's not just the assessed value. I think we're starting to see a bit of the impact of the shared economy and e-commerce is retailers are more successfully appealing what MPAC assumes as it relates to their
values. Didn't we take the Home Depot hit last year?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the Home Depot settlement we just received 3 weeks ago. So we might have addressed it as a risk, but the minutes of settlement, I believe we just received 3 weeks ago.
And what's the reduction for Hamilton?
I'd have to, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I don't have the recall, but I know it was isolated to the Centennial and I'm going to say Ancaster Meadowland facility, so I can get that information to committee.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Councillor Green, and then Councillor Marula is going to move a couple of motions.
Thank you. One of the slides, slide 27, that caught my eye had, I think, some of our collective agreements and settlements. How are the settlements broken out? It's not, sorry, it wasn't this one. It wasn't 27. It was it had COLA on the top line, some of our liabilities. There we go. Salary and wage compensation. So out of that $9 million, how much of that is settlements?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the majority of that is our collective agreement requirements. So in terms of all of your other employee-related costs, there'll be the merit increases. So as someone matures and grows within the organization, they are entitled to merit or step increases until such time as they reach the max. So that's captured there. So this is in terms of COLA settlements, that is principally our collective agreement.
So I misunderstood that. When I read settlements, I thought it might have had to have been kind of monies that have gone out to people on frivolous lawsuits. What does that look like?
Through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, we'd have to report back if the councillor's asking around employee-related versus...
No. Just globally, anytime we're sued, I saw that number and saw that word and obviously didn't understand the context within the salary and wage. I thought it was compensations that might have been out to your slip and falls, to any boards and agencies. And I hear this often about our risks. So those are the premiums for...
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the $800,000 represents a risk or an additional pressure. And if we look at the services who are having claims that the city is having to pay out on, it is principally sidewalks, roads, represents about 41% of the pressure, police maybe 18%, and then transit represents a pressure as well, and there was a fourth one.
And it's just neatly tied in. So the premium is on our insurance policy that covers that stuff?
Yes, so through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, it affects us in two ways as it relates to risk. It affects us in claims, what we pay out, recognizing we have a deductible, anything over and above that deductible, but that pattern will affect us in terms of your premium. So as a property owner, if you have a higher level of average floods or break and enters or some other activity, you're going to have the impact of the cost over and above your deductible, but as well, the next time you go out to renew your insurance you'll see a bump up in the cost of the premium. And so that level of claim activity is having an impact. We'll break down, it's currently, because we have an agreement with our insurer, this would principally reflect claim costs, but we'll break that down for you as we bring that information forward. We'll differentiate between claims versus our premium.
Yeah, I mean, at first glance, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the 800,000 isn't quite at first blush what I saw when I saw 8.9 million, and I, in my head, wrapped those two together. So I appreciate that distinction, and I look forward to the report back.
Thank you. Move to receive Mike's presentation. Moved by Councillor Johnson.
My apologies, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I wasn't in the room, so do you mind? I just have one quick question on the very next slide, please. And it's been asked, my apologies. The City Enrichment Fund 2%, is this something that is just an ongoing 2% increase, or is it just requested for this year? Because I just had a City Enrichment Fund agenda meeting, and they seem a little shocked by the fact they're getting an increase.
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I'm not sure if this is an assumption we've made, but we'll confirm whether it's an assumption that we've made, just an inflationary assumption. Staff are nodding their heads. So rather than we've been conservative with the forecast. We made an assumption that there may be a consideration to increase it. We made the assumption that it's related to inflation. That would represent 2%. But again, that would be subject to the committee and council's consideration.
Okay, thank you for that, because we're having a City Enrichment Fund meeting right after this GIC, and I believe that's on the agenda through Councillor Green's questioning about the reserves. So that one we think we can just earmark. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem.
And I'll move to receive. Thanks.
Seconded by Councillor Vanderbeek. All in favor? Any opposed? Councillor Marula with your motion. Seconded by Councillor Whitehead.
Yes, and it's moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Whitehead, that subsection B, respecting the 2018 budget guidelines, preliminary outlook, and process be deleted in its entirety and replaced with the following in lieu thereof. That boards and agencies be requested to submit their 2018 operating budget based on a guideline increase of 1.5%, and that an increase beyond the guideline be forwarded for consideration and with appropriate explanation. B, that subsection C, respecting the 2018 budget guidelines, preliminary outlook and process be deleted in its entirety and replaced with the following in lieu thereof, that all city departments target a 2018 operating budget guideline based on an increase of 1.5%, that any increase beyond the guideline be forwarded for consideration with appropriate explanation. And just quickly, we have had history of setting these targets and allowing staff to, particularly Mike, to work his magic in conjunction with council to determine what our priorities are and what can be deferred for future deliberation or outright cuts accordingly, as we have in the past. And I think this will give us at least something to work with and target in the future, and allow us to at least have staff understand where we're headed, so that their recommendations can be formulated accordingly. And I look forward to your support. Thank you, Mr.
Very good. Anybody? On the motion by Councillor Marula, seconded by Councillor Whitehead. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none. And now to move the motion as amended. To move it would be Councillor Whitehead, seconded by Councillor Skelly. On that, as amended, Councillor Jackson.
Mr. Deputy Mayor, thank you, and I didn't get a chance to thank General Manager Mike Zagaric. Mike, outstanding preliminary report of our outlook for 18, giving us a several-month lead time to digest. Mr. Deputy Mayor, so this is on 7.2, the motion as the report as amended. I just want to be recorded as opposed to item E, the water rate of 4.5%. I'm worried that not only is staff wanting 4.5%, but I'm worried it's going to possibly come in even a higher request in the next few months, given the extremely wet summer that we've had and the lower amount of consumption. And again, just in light of everything homeowners experience, I just want to get ahead of it now. Record me as opposed only to the E part. Thank you.
Okay, all in favor? Oh, Councillor Partridge.
Yeah, I'll be recorded as opposed to E as well, and almost for the identical reasons. I just think 4.5%, I just think it's outrageous at this point, considering the rate increases that we've already gone through. Thank you.
All in favor? Councillor Whitehead.
I just asked the staff, we had a projected forecast that, and a plan that this council approved in regards to having water, wastewater become sustainable on the rates. Is this above that plan?
Mike?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, the recommendation 4.5 is consistent with what was approved by Council in principle as part of the rate budget's 10-year forecast. So again, this is no different than what was before you as part of the 2017 deliberations as to what we are forecasting for 2018.
I appreciate that. So the reason I'm raising that, Mr. Chair, is this is so important in principle when this council looks at a plan, and we were, believe it or not, and Dan can confirm this, one of the first, or Mike Zagaric, one of the leaders in regards to way ahead of the curve on water, wastewater, and funding through rates to be more sustainable. Is that correct, Michael? We were at the front end of this?
Michael?
So through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, back in the early 90s, council would have, or sorry, maybe mid-90s, the council approved an aggressive rate forecast increase of 15% annually for a 5-year period. So while that was amended slightly over that period is, again, the reason that we are more competitive in terms of rate increase relative to other municipalities is, Councillor Whitehead's correct, is previous councils were supportive of the water wastewater program and had approved an aggressive increase in terms of the level of funding for water and wastewater program.
So this number represents that principle, that strategy, the fact that it'll be self-sustainable. It's lower than all our comparators. This council agreed in the principle. I would only suggest that, I don't like paying high taxes. I've been challenging a lot of areas, but this is a self-sustained plan that we agreed in principle, and therefore I wholeheartedly support it.
Okay, all in favor, who moved this? Councillor Whitehead, seconded by Councillor Skelly, as amended. Move, all in favor?
Carried.
And opposed to E is Councillor Jackson and Councillor Partridge. And no opposed otherwise. Okay, that moves forward on to discussion items. 8.1, need a mover. Seconded by, let's move by Marula and seconded by Councillor Pearson. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none. 8.2, moved by Green. Councillor Green, sorry about that.
Thank you very much. So this is the Erase Grant program that's applied to.
Hey, wait, I wanted to speak to 8.1.
Do you want to speak to 8.1? Yeah. I'll step down.
We've already moved the item, but if you want to speak to it after the fact, that's.
Yes, please.
Okay. We passed it. You want to move? You want to speak to it at council?
Okay.
You want to do that? Okay. On 8.2. Green.
I just wanted to thank staff, in particular Glenn Nord and his team. You'll know Paul Ilya's work. He's a renowned Hamilton artist, has decided to expand his studio space and take over this eyesore of a building and move in and provide an incredible addition to our community, and certainly is taking this remediation seriously. And I'm just grateful that we're able to work with him and provide this opportunity for adaptive reuse. I think it's everything that the program is designed to be. Thank you. So moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Marula.
All in favor? Any opposed? That carries 8-3. Moved by Pearson, seconded by Ferguson. All in favor? Any opposed? That carries 8-4. And on 8.4, Councillor Skelly, the fashion incubator.
Thank you. Through the chair, Jason's not here. Maybe you can speak to this, Glenn. I was very surprised when the report finally came back, It's not at all what I was expecting. I was a little disappointed, well, I was terribly disappointed, to be very honest with you. The report was commissioned to, in what I thought, and perhaps there was a communication breakdown between myself, perhaps other members of council when we authorized it or agreed to it, and staff, but I was hoping we could assess the possibility of having a fashion incubator in the city of Hamilton, thus looking at the viability of the fashion or the fabric district down on Ottawa Street, looking at how many artists we currently have, designers in the city. Are they homegrown? Did they relocate here from Toronto? Are there any, opportunities to tap into a shrinking Toronto market? What we were given for the amount of money we paid was a consultant's report that didn't have one word mentioning Hamilton. And it only talks about what's being done in other centers around the world. And it's really not what I was hoping we would have received. That report, through the chair, actually triggered my interest in finding out how many other consulting projects or contracts were awarded to this particular consulting company, and we will be getting that on Wednesday. But dealing with this today, is there any particular reason that this is what we requested? I was really hoping that we would have an assessment of the viability of a fashion incubator in the city, especially in light of the fact that we have such an incredibly thriving fabric district in the Ottawa, on Ottawa Street.
Actually, Mr. Deputy Mayor, Director Anna Bradford's going to take that question.
Thank you.
Anna?
The chair, and my apologies, I left the report in the room. If you could just give me that quickly again, I'll be happy to answer it.
I got it right here.
The question.
The question, sorry.
The question, sorry.
No,
The question in a nutshell is,
yeah.
why is there no reference to Hamilton in a report to determine whether we can sustain a fashion incubator in the city? And perhaps it was a breakdown in communication, but I was really startled that this report we commissioned has no reference to the city.
So through the chair, what we looked at was, when we first talked about this, it was to look at considering opportunities for community groups and the possibility of a fashion incubator in the former Eastmount School. So what we wanted to do was look at what would it take to be a successful fashion incubator in the city of Hamilton first, before we did a lot of work, particularly towards a geographic location. So that's what this study is about, and it provides us with information on what will work, what will not work as we go forward with these projects.
Thank you, through the chair. Again, I'm just going to state that I was terribly disappointed in the report that was presented. I was hoping we would have some reference to the city of Hamilton. When you look at the initial recommendation, council directed staff to conduct a study on the feasibility of creating a fashion incubator in the city. You would assume, at least I certainly did, and perhaps obviously incorrectly, that would include some information about whether or not we have artists, or how many artists or designers currently operate in the city. Again, why they move here, were they homegrown? There's absolutely no reference to the city. Very, very disappointed in the study. Information that I think I could have accessed online had I wanted to find out what other communities are doing. I was really looking forward to seeing something much more representative of the potential in this city, and I will make you aware that it was because of my disappointment in this particular outcome of this request and this consultant's report that I asked how many other reports this consultant has been commissioned to do for the city of Hamilton, and I was surprised, actually, and that information is going to be coming forward on Wednesday. Thank you.
I'll put myself on the speakers list and give the chair to Councillor Partridge.
Go ahead.
First and foremost, I have the absolute opposite opinion of Civic Plan. They're the consultants who put this project together. They've done amazing work. Formerly, I think it was the Center for Civic Inclusion. Extremely progressive, young, Hamilton, born and bred. couple who have been incredible. So I just want to get that on the record, and fair enough, there's concerns in how this particular consultant or whatever this consultant was asked to achieve. I'm sure that was fulfilled. So it may be more of an issue with the interpretation of the motion itself. So do we have, I do not see the motion that led to this report in the report. So if we have that on today's public record, that might be helpful. So we can get a sense to whether or not the origins of the previous speaker's issues or confusion were the result of the motion itself or staff's interpretation. But I have never seen a report, and they've had they carried out our participatory budgeting process to great success here in the city, and I know they've done some work with Ward 1 as well. So I just want to make sure we don't have anything said. I know the consultant's name wasn't mentioned, and that's probably appreciated, but it's right there in the report. And I have a completely opposite experience, and I know other jurisdictions outside of Hamilton do as well when it comes to working with civic plans. So do we have the motion through you?
So Madam Clerk?
Yes, through you, Councillor Partridge. I do have the original motion.
Could you read it, please, through you, Chair?
Certainly. It was staff was directed to conduct a feasibility study for a fashion incubator at the Eastmount School site that would include, but not be limited to the following, and report back to the General Issues Committee: fashion and related businesses, opportunities for community groups, operating costs offset by partnerships with the private sector, and steps to transform the former elementary school into a place for creative people to work, connect with peers, and learn to further their trades.
Thank you, Madam Clerk.
Okay, so fair enough. Through you to Anna. Anna, so that is a very hyper-local, in my opinion, recommendation, and to my recollection, it was focused particularly on the East Mountain, or the Central Mountain School. So what led to a focus on, probably my guess is we haven't studied fashion, and we often look to our comparators or outside folks who are already doing it to first get some leverage and a better understanding on how something like that works. You can't understand how something like that works if you don't already have it in your community, which we do not. So was that the line of thinking from your culture department, to first understand how it works elsewhere before we can answer any of the other questions?
Anna?
Through the chair, that's correct. So what we did is we unpacked the motion because it had a lot of information in it, and we broke it down into steps. The first step was to look at what it takes to run a successful fashion incubator, and that's what Civic Plan was hired to do. So they did do that. They provided a matrix for us. We layered the matrix against Eastmount School first, and it was not feasible for that school, so we didn't do the other parts of the motion because it would have been irrelevant at that point.
I see.
Councillor?
Okay, well, that does make sense. So it's not necessarily a disconnect. It's just two different lines of thought from two different areas, one political, another in terms of our experienced staff on how you'd proceed with such a motion that came obviously from this horseshoe. So fair enough, appreciate it. I did go through this report a little bit, not completely. It seems very thorough. It's not an area, obviously, of my expertise, but it's still an initiative that I would support somewhere in this city, and I thought a really good one initially when we moved the motion forward. But again, I actually would welcome, if we're going to start taking a look at what consultants do for us and pick out or pick on any one group, let's get started with Civic Plan, because it's nothing, as far as I can see, in this the work that they've done, particularly with Ward 2, and other city reports that I've seen them participate in, nothing but stellar. So we'll be off to a really good start in making those reviews a reality. So I'll take the chair back.
Before you do, I have Councillor Whitehead, Councillor Skelly for a second time, and Councillor Green for a first time.
Councillor Whitehead.
And Councillor Green.
Thank you. It's nothing like having a downtown-centric consultant do this report. The mountain issue to me. I'm putting that out because I've seen the report.
So they've done work. I would challenge that. How do I challenge that?
That's an opinion.
It's not accurate.
That's an opinion.
I think they did push links recently.
Councillors, can we get the clerk to weigh in, please?
Mr. Deputy Mayor, you really can't challenge it. It is a comment. However, I would caution all of you that to focus more on the report before we go into a direction that we don't need to go into.
There's a point of order.
Thank you, Clerk.
Madam Chair, my issue here is that if you take a look at the type of work this particular consultant does and how often they do it for the city, I think it speaks for itself, and I'll leave it at that. The piece I have and the concern I have is usually you design a terms of reference and you work with the mover of the motion, or would be probably a good place to start in regards to developing terms of reference for the consultant so they have an understanding of the scoping. The other primary issue that I have is what is the critical mass? What is the mapping? What is the economies of scale within our own community in regards to the possible viability of such an initiative? And I don't see that mapped out. And that would be the rudimentary thing where you would think you would start to understand what's actually happening in this community and whether there's an opportunity and need. That's not what this report does. So I think it's way off the mark. I think it's one that's needed at some point in time. I just think that it was premature because, first of all, I think we need to understand what's happening in our community. So the fact that they leap to suggest that because it's on the mountain that it's not a viable location concerns me. Because I don't see the empirical data that really justifies that assertion without doing all the mapping and understanding what's happening in the community and what kind of incentives could be offered as well. So I want to make clear that I was sharing my personal opinion. Having said that, I think the reports they've done speak for themselves. No one has to say anything else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and I think bringing this back on track, I'd like to offer the following, Mr. Deputy Mayor, that currently the province is undergoing a collective impact model for adaptive reuse of schools. There's before us, and I appreciate the councillors moving of this motion. You don't want to see these assets turned over and just kind of planned in any way that's, turned into subdivisions or what have you. So I can appreciate that. It does strike me, though, in the conversations we have around the table about the private sector, maybe there's a space, regardless of this particular consultant's report, to go out, whether it's the mover of the motion under her own accord, bring some stakeholders to this project and prove or demonstrate the feasibility of it before the actual implementation of the purchase of the property. I know as a councillor, to move forward in the direction that she's seeking to find. So, we've heard Councillor Ferguson do a low, I think, no net lease type deal with the Ancaster Centre for the Arts. I know all of us have these visions in our community that might supersede the visions of consultants who come in, regardless of where we want to say that they're centered. I'd like to think consultants work with the facts, but I'll take that and let's just put it aside. Let's see if there isn't a model of collective impact where the mover of the motion and folks from the quote-unquote private sector that are out there in fashion, in industry, in academia, maybe the building, not the building trades, but the ministry responsible for these types of portfolios, innovation, retail, commerce, trade, post-secondary education, bringing on a stakeholder like a Mohawk or somebody else who's out there who's ready to roll with it. Maybe the mover can do that and then revisit this. So maybe this is a motion or a report that we just receive and then come back with a reconfigured proposal that has a little bit of the heavy lifting already done to prove its viability. Because I'm not here to say whether it's viable or not. But I think the mover of the motion probably would have consulted some people in the community to test the viability, which is why she believes in it, which is why I would assume that she took over the property for this purpose. So I don't know if through you to the Deputy Mayor, if the mover cares to comment on potentially some of the shareholders or stakeholders that she's consulted with that has demonstrated the viability of this project before we decide to move forward.
I think she's asking you.
It is a direct question to Councillor Donna Scully.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you for that. I have been working with a number of not private sector groups, but not-for-profits, and a number who have shown a great deal of interest in occupying this facility. My original intent with, first of all, I didn't, the building was already purchased before I was elected, so I inherited the building. And there is a motion before us already to demolish the building. And I visited the property through the chair and felt that the property should remain intact and that we could find other uses for it. I visited Councillor Brenda Johnson's ward and looked at an interesting use of one of the properties there. I've met with many groups who are interested. The big conundrum is I don't want this to fall on the backs of the taxpayer. So I was hoping that the groups could absorb the cost of operating the building for a $2 annual fee or whatever of renting it. The issue is the state of the building, which I'm still challenging because our staff have come back with a cost of about $4 million. And I still think if you bring in somebody from the private sector, they say, well, it's really not in that bad a shape. It was occupied, the summer before we took ownership of it, or maybe it was the year before. The bottom line is when we decided, and I spoke with Jason Thorne about this, he suggested the fashion incubator, and I thought it wasn't a wasted exercise. The truth is, I spend a lot of time on Ottawa Street, and the truth is, if you're going to have a fashion incubator, it's probably better in the lower part of the city in light of the fact that we have such a thriving fashion district, or at least fabric district, in the lower part of the city. So I thought this wouldn't have been a wasted exercise. We'll get the data, we'll find out how many designers are in the city, how vibrant is the retail component of Ottawa Street. So this would have been a valuable piece of information. What was handed to me was not at all what I was expecting. I was expecting a hyper-local approach to our request from council. So that is what I'm suggesting to you and in response to you. I still hope that we can have representatives from the community, not-for-profits, come forward and acquire this building, take on the cost. The problem right now is it too prohibitive to bring it to a standard that would allow groups to occupy it? If it's $4 million, they're saying we can't afford that. But if we can do it cheaper, then we can keep the building up and we can bring in a number of groups who are very interested, which would bring a vitality to the community. Otherwise, the building will have to be leveled. In terms of the report itself, I still think that it isn't what we had asked for. We had asked for some sort of a reflection of how viable a fashion component could be in the city of Hamilton. What we got was what's happening elsewhere around the world.
Okay. Councillor Green, you still have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Mayor, and I appreciate the fullness of the answer. I would agree, and I certainly held my tongue about Ottawa Street because it would have just been completely self-serving when this was coming out earlier. I left it at that, knowing that the councillor probably had her own vision, so I didn't interject with that, but I would agree, you're probably right there. Having said that, and recognizing what Minister Mitzi Hunter has put forward in the Ministry of Education with adaptive reuse on schools, I think that there could be potentially on the table an opportunity for upper levels of government to, because they're doing this now, they're recognizing this with their assets, to partner up in a collective impact model with some of your nonprofits, perhaps some folks from retail, and the city to either take care of the infrastructure costs and or look at other opportunities to offset the cost. So basically, Mr. Deputy Mayor, what I'm just presenting today is that I think that there are opportunities that this deal doesn't just die here, that we don't just kill it and say, well, because of this report, we leave it. I think that the councillor, with a little bit more work, perhaps, and reaching out to the other levels of government and doing research there, might find that there is already a prescribed model for how we deal with our schools. So I remain supportive of this in principle and allowing this opportunity to kind of move forward and be explored. If it's the case that the councillor just pulls it and is would prefer to spend time on the consultant's report, that's her prerogative. Thanks.
Second time, Councillor Kelly.
I think I'm going to actually follow your direction, Councillor. Thank you for that, and I would like to explore this. I think the building is, as I said, I have a difference of opinion with staff on the building itself, and I'm hoping it isn't $4 million worth of work that has to be done. As I said, I've had people in the private sector walk through and say it's in much better shape. So I would like to actually take your suggestion and move forward with exploring other opportunities for the use of the building and meeting with provincial officials and other stakeholders in the community to see other opportunities for use of the building. If I could have a seconder. Seconded by Councillor Green. No?
Oh, my apologies. You're referring to use of Eastmount?
Yes.
That, we already have a resolution on the
That's
floor
right.
for that, for staff to demolish, which currently stands. So before you could move any additional motion with respect to that matter, staff would have to go, this would have to go back to council. Council would have to reconsider with a 2/3 vote the original motion that lets Public Works staff demolish the property. Yes, you did.
No, it passed in a
This
previous
passed
meeting.
before we... Can we
The
table
question
the
is, can we
recommendation?
table the recommendation?
At this point, I would say no. You're probably best to bring forward a motion after you move forward at council to reconsider the demolition, because unless you have council's approval, staff right now can move forward if this report doesn't pass, or even if this report passes, can move forward to demolish it. There's nothing from stopping staff. Right now, they actually have the authority to do so. So until that matter is reconsidered, that demolition could happen before the other motion gets passed or is tabled. So it's really not, you can do it at council immediately following the reconsideration motion if you want.
Sorry, sorry. Mr. Chair, may I ask Councillor Johnson just to...
You have the floor.
Listening to Stephanie, I would suggest you bring a motion to council to reconsider the demolition, and following that, if it passes, then you can bring your secondary motion that Councillor Green has suggested.
Okay. Through the clerk, if I may then, dealing with this, we just table this?
No, if you're going to do this, you can still pass this to receive this report.
Just to receive
You can
it?
still do this one here. Let me just read B, my apologies. You could still also pass subsection B if you want staff to use the information for other work, and then just bring forward a separate motion.
I think we're just going to receive it.
First time speaker, Councillor Jackson, and then Councillor Marullo.
Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Just to offer some perspective here and a little historical context, it was, as Councillor Skelly said just before she arrived in Ward 7, that in the 5-month gap that Councillor Whitehead and I were looking after matters in Ward 7, that we got council support to purchase Eastmount at the time, which we were grateful for on behalf of the community. If I recall, this is getting a little bit convoluted because I know in discussions with Councillor Skelly, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I don't recall that demolition of the Eastmount School site was an automatic path forward. In fact, in discussions with her in various departments of the city, we've got a community center in that same block, which is tired, has probably needed a significant amount of renovations if it's going to exist in the future. And the discussions were ensuing that whether or not we keep the school, as Councillor Skelly had desired, to repurpose it in some way in a number of fashions that she has expressed here today and before over the last year, and or possibly then demolish the community center, keep both, put the money of one towards the other. I think there was a wide range of options that, if memory serves me right, were still on the table. So if demolition has been unequivocally moved, and that's the path forward without any of these other considerations, something in my mind, Mr. Deputy Mayor, has gone awry here, and we need to hopefully then between now and council on Friday, we need to correct that, again, with the Ward 7 councillors' permission and concurrence. Thanks, Mr.
Madam
Deputy
Clerk.
Mayor.
Here, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I had a pile of copies of it for last week, and for some reason it's not with me here today. So after today's meeting, I will go back downstairs and I'll clarify to all members of council via email, unless I can find it during this meeting, whether or not I believed it to be demolition. If I'm wrong, I'd be happy to tell you that as well. But I'll send you the resolution that was passed after this meeting just to confirm so that you can address it at council.
Councillor Marula.
Just make a friendly suggestion that everything be tabled until we get clarity on the issue before council, and then we can move forward on accordingly.
Thank you. I have myself on the list as a second-time speaker, and then I'll come back with a tabling motion to you, Councillor Marula, through you to culture staff or Glenn. A lot of times we move motions, and there's clearly a clarity issue. There was an expectation, and now that I've had the motion read for public record, I could understand where this disconnect is. A lot of times we move motions, and the appropriate staff come to our offices, and we discuss what direction are you intending here with this motion, that you get clarity before you go off and do any work, whether internal or by a great consulting company such as this one. Did you not have that opportunity with the Ward 7 councillor or the Ward 7 councillor's office after the original motion?
Anna?
Yes, through the chair. It was my understanding. I know that we had met. I was pleased that Councillor Scully, the way that she had done the motion so that we could unpack it and look at things in layers. So if one part wasn't going to work, that we wouldn't be wasting any taxpayers' money on doing a larger study, that type of thing. In respect to Civic Plan, we only asked them to look at what a fashion incubator success factors would. We didn't ask them to look at Hamilton. And we wanted to make sure that we looked at those success factors, layered them over Eastmount School so that we could speak to this motion. The work that was done is not wasted, because if we decide that it's something that we want to pursue in the future, we have that good information with us now. So that's why we did it that way. It was to save money and time.
Councillor?
So I'm clear through you, Chair. You did meet with the councillor following the motion and set forward some plan to answer to the motion? You did meet with the ward councillor?
Anna?
That's correct. We did meet with the ward councillor, and then when the study came out, we met with the ward councillor again and looked through the recommendations and things. So again, in respect to Councillor Scully, I really like the way that she positioned this so that we could do it in layers like that.
It's just the printer.
Okay. Thank you. I will take the chair back, and we have a tabling motion in just a moment. And sorry,
I'd like to
Councillor
speak
Scully,
to
a third time.
Yes, I just wanted to speak to that. We did meet through the chair, and my assumption was that we would get a report back that would outline all of the opportunities available within the city of Hamilton to develop a fashion industry. Thank you.
Madam Clerk.
I found it. The report is PED 15127, and it is from February 3rd, 2016 GIC, and staff from real estate was directed to acquire the property, and it says, subject to successful acquisition of the property, staff be authorized and directed to demolish the existing surplus school structure and finish the property with a grassed area. The Recreation Division be directed to complete a recreation needs assessment for Eastmount Park with the subject lands, including engagement of the ward councillor, adjacent community, and recreation stakeholders. And there are several more as well. So if the property has been purchased, then staff does have that direction at this time.
Second time, Councillor Jackson.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And to dovetail on what she has just, Mr. Deputy Mayor, provided, February of 16 would be about a month and a half before Councillor Skelly arrived here at City Hall. And under the plan that, knowing myself, a number of the stakeholders that have a baseball association there, that have a community purely run volunteer program there for low-income families and those type of families that are in financial hardship that otherwise wouldn't be able to even afford a Thanksgiving or Christmas Day dinner. I was very familiar with a number of those groups, and I had suggested at the time, before who was going to represent Ward 7 in the future, and I'm putting this on the record, I had suggested maybe we could convert that existing building by demolishing it, providing additional green space and or recreational opportunities for expansion of existing programs. So that was then, and I stand by that. When Councillor Skelly got elected and came here, had some different ideas and visioning for the entire block. We've been in discussions. I've provided her and have facilitated meetings with existing groups, so she has a better understanding too of those that have been stakeholders for years, but she brought her own ideas to the table. So we need to, if you will, amend that on Friday to incorporate Councillor Skelly's arrival to City Hall, because that was then and this is now. Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor, for allowing me providing that clarification.
Councillor Marula, tabling motion.
Moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Green, that the item be tabled until we can receive full clarity on the report accordingly.
On the tabling, Councillor Partridge.
No, actually, I had a question on recreation staff, so it's not on the tabling.
All in favor? Carried. Any opposed? And on to 8.5, Hamilton Future Fund. Move it. Pearson, seconded by Partridge. All in favor? On 8.5, Councillor Skelly.
Thank you. Through the chair, the additional $500,000 for the adaptive reuse of St. Mark's, is this an additional $500,000? How much is already allocated to the St. Mark's?
Anna Bradford? Is the 500K identified for St. Mark's in addition to?
In other words, how much is the
Yes,
city
it is.
through the chair?
And what's the budget for St. Mark's, I believe was the question. Is that right?
Correct. Thank you very much.
Through the chair, I don't have the budget figures with me right now, but I'll be happy to send them forward in an email. The 500,000 is, we're looking at probably having some unforeseen conditions in the building, so we wanted to have that money in place just in case sewer hookups, things like that. I know the Councillor Farr and I have talked about this a lot. And if that doesn't happen, then the money will go against the budget that has been forecasted in the capital budget then, so that we will have some savings at the end to be distributed to other projects.
Thank you.
Councillor Whitehead.
When we entered into this, this project with the full enthusiasm of your department, can I understand, we did an assessment in regards to the property and needs, did we not? Evaluation? We understand what the risks were financially?
Yes, I believe, through the chair, yes.
We did an assessment?
Yes.
Over and above that assessment, you found yet another problem?
Through the chair, we haven't found that we've had another problem, but we are always anticipating that there could be something. When you're dealing with heritage properties, that does happen. So we're looking to the Future Fund to help us because we have dedicated money into future capital budgets to complete the project. So if we don't use it all, then we can distribute the rest of that capital fund to other heritage projects.
Is this the first application of Future Fund for St. Mark's?
Through the chair, yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Councillor Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and through you to Anna. Anna, I sit on the Future Fund. Now, when you do the application coming forward, is it going to be clear in that application what you just said?
Through the chair, yes.
Okay, so you will let the board members know that the funds could be directed to other heritage projects?
Through the chair, no, that's not what I meant. What I meant was that it would still be towards St. Mark's, but if we didn't use the whole budget within our capital budget for
Right.
St. Mark's right now, if there was money left over, that is the money that would be distributed to other projects. All the money from the Heritage Fund would go directly into St. Mark's.
So did I hear you say, through you, Chair, did I hear you say that at this point you haven't, or staff have not identified what the issue is or may be?
Through the chair, we have worked with the ward councillor and we are getting some indications, especially around the sewer hookup.
Okay, because I think it needs to be clear when you're coming in and applying for funds for the Future Fund, which are to be used for legacy projects. It needs to be clear what the money is going to be used for. Okay, thank you. Those are my comments.
Good, thank you very much for that. Councillor Brenda Johnson.
Yep, thank you. And through you to Anna, my understanding from listening is that this is basically a safety net in case you come into any unforeseen problems, correct?
Through the chair, yes, but the monies will all be used for St. Mark's.
Will all be used for St. Mark's?
Yes, because we've gone into future capital allocations for St. Mark's project. If we put the Future Fund money in there, we do the project and there's monies left over, that goes back into our capital accounts and that money would be used for other projects.
So through you to Anna, why 500,000? Why not 200,000? Why not $1 million? Why was 500,000 chosen? Because my understanding is, and I don't sit on the Future Fund, but for city enrichment and for all the other grant processes, there's actual dollars that they're asking for, and this is why, and it's all highlighted. Having a safety net is wonderful, but why 500,000?
I'll have to, through the chair, I would have to get some explanation from our construction people. I know the sewer hookup alone, we talked about 200,000, 240,000, and that was just one piece of it. So let me get you some good information and I'll send it out in an email.
Did I hear that right through you, Deputy Mayor, to Anna? $200,000 to hook up to sewer?
It was built on dirt.
Okay, whoa, sorry. 200,000 to hook up to sewer.
Correct. That's what we know at this point on hooking up the sewer. It was unhooked a long time ago, and we have all sorts of foundation problems that have been caused because of that. So it's about a $240,000.
Are we servicing the rest of the block with 240,000? I'm not being facetious, Anna, I swear to God, and you're not a sewer hookup person either, so I'm just putting it out there. We've now just put sewers down Highway 56, and the average cost for the average homeowner was $25,000. Some have basements, some do not. So that wasn't the issue. It's just, and this blows me away, $240,000. So whenever I hear anybody complain about $20,000 to hook up to sewers, I'm going to say, well, that's nothing. If we can get some sort, I need some sort of, I'm a real process girl. I like to see the actual monies, where they're going to, and we've talked about consulting fees, how they're ridiculously high, design fees are ridiculously high. So I would be more comfortable getting a more detailed about this. I don't sit on the future fund, as I said earlier, so probably I'm asking on behalf of them. And I would assume that whatever the money that was not used up, it goes back to the future fund, as all our funding sources do. So those are my comments right now, but $240,000. Wow.
So through the chair, those are all good questions, and I could be misstating, not understanding it correctly. So let me get some good information for you so that we can both feel comfortable with it.
And thanks, Anna, because it's really unfortunate it's not in here already, because this basically asking for $1.1 million for whatever. That's what it seems like. So I just didn't want you to feel like I'm picking on you, but $1.1 million is a lot of money. Thank you.
Who did I have next? Councillor Partridge, second time.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Anna, when was St. Mark's built?
Through the chair, I'm not sure, 1886 or something around there. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head.
No, that's close enough. And I guess, but what really makes me uncomfortable about this is we did have an application come in for the Troy schoolhouse, and for around the same amount of money for almost the same type of issues to do with foundations, and they actually got turned down by the Future Fund. And it was only because of good Councillor Robert Pasuta, the ward councillor, coming forward. He was able to get them $75,000 of the $600,000 that they needed. So I'm really uncomfortable with this, but I'll deal with it when it comes forward to the Future Fund.
Okay, anybody else on the item, which is 8.5? Hamilton Children's Museum, $600K app to FF. St. Mark's, $500K app to FF.
My apologies. I heard a mover for 8.5, but I didn't hear a seconder at all.
I'll second it. Okay, seconded by Green. Who was the mover? Councillor Pearson. All in favor? Partridge, sorry. All in favor? Any opposed? Thank you. 8.6, poverty reduction, Councillor Green. 8.6, Councillor Green.
Yeah, given the size of this report and its importance, I'd like to ask staff to give a summary.
As it turns out, the mayor is not in attendance for today's meeting, and he's out of the country on city business for September 6th. So the mayor has actually requested on this item, I'm sorry I missed this, that it be tabled to the September 20th GIC. And that's seconded, moved by Green and seconded by Councillor Whitehead on the tabling motion.
Yeah, I just want to provide some direction.
On the tabling? Okay, please do now at this time.
Yeah, could I have a companion report to come back in respect to economic development, what investments or incentives we're creating and how much employment we're creating? We got one shot at balancing the ledger in regards to ensuring we generate revenue at the same time we're dealing with people that...
This isn't, just a point of order, this isn't...
instruction.
No, it's not. That's a separate motion.
I'm asking for an accompanying document.
Then that should be presented in a separate motion.
Okay, hey, whoa.
Actually,
Come on, Mr. Deputy Mayor,
Yeah, I'm
get a
sorry,
handle
I
of the
was
meeting
actually
here.
reading, I was trying to gain some perspective myself. This is item 8.6, the Poverty Reduction Investment Plan, and the motion is to table it to the September 20th GIC. And you're asking that with this report, a companion piece be contemplated?
correct.
And you're asking who?
Economic development.
And through you then, Glenn, can you offer some form of companion piece with this?
Sorry, Deputy Chair, I was talking to Director Bradford on our way out there. What was the question?
Okay, so we have the Poverty Reduction Investment Plan before us, item 8.6.
Yep.
We're moving to table, moved by Green, seconded by Councillor Whitehead, but he's asked if you could include on September 20th, should the tabling motion pass, a companion piece, Councillor Whitehead, that specifically speaks to, Councillor Whitehead?
To economic development and investment opportunities or incentive opportunities that should be considered for future capital or future investment.
Okay, so how, I got it.
No, I don't think you do.
How
This
is
is an
relevant?
amendment.
If you know, just give Councillor Whitehead a little bit of leeway, explain how this may be relevant, enlighten us.
Mr. Chair, I don't want to get into the debate now, but I think we will have a discussion. I guess my concern is that I'm not speaking to it.
No, hey, come on now.
I'm speaking to the table, the direction. Mr. Chair, I'm quite prepared to
Separate motion?
talk to our economic development. I've already had this discussion with the city manager and our economic development. They know where my concerns are in regards to the lack of attention and focus on economic development in this community. We'll have that discussion later on. Thank you.
Okay, wow. Okay, so you're still going to second this tabling motion?
Yeah.
Very good. All in favor? Any opposed? We'll see you on the 20th. The 8.7 BIA Advisory Committee report. Any discussions? Moved by Ferguson, seconded by Councillor Aidan Johnson. All in favor? That's carried. School Board Property Subcommittee. Just a reminder, committee, if you want to discuss private and confidential Appendix D to this item 8.8, we'll have to defer this item to closed session. And Councillor Marula, I understand you have a motion to amend item 5 of this report. So this was Councillor Collins' motion that you've offered to move on his behalf. Okay, so just before we get to you, sorry, Councillor Marula, I think Councillor Skelly would like to speak to 8.8 as it stands currently.
Correct. Item 2, through the chair, on 70 Bobolink Road. I did speak with staff, but until I realized that there is a neighborhood park deficiency, I'd like to table this, or at least refer it for further discussion, if that's possible.
Item 2 of the report to be tabled, seconded by Councillor Jackson. All in favor of item 2 to be tabled? Any opposed? It carries unanimously. Thank you, Councillor Skelly. Councillor Jackson.
Yeah, Mr. Deputy Mayor, being on the School Board Properties Committee, I had raised under the, before the meeting had adjourned.
Social housing.
Okay, let's keep it down just a little bit. Carry on, Councillor Jackson.
Thanks so much, Mr. Deputy Mayor. So I had, if members of committee who were there that day recall, before we adjourned, I had raised the specter of the future Henderson-Barton site, the 12-acre site, that has in the past been part of the Hamilton-Wentworth District School Board's plan to close the Henderson-Barton site before probably this term of council's over. And I had put the committee on notice. I tried to do that as part of my practice here at City Hall so that none of my colleagues in the future are blindsided, especially if there's a significant potential purchase price attached. And I just don't see it in the information section. I had raised it. No action to be taken at the July meeting of the School Board Property Subcommittee, but I wanted to put my committee colleagues on notice that probably a few months from now, and I'm working with a number of multiple partners about the potential repurposing and or acquisition, hopefully, of the Henderson-Barton site on Palmer Road. When I just didn't see any note or comment of it in the information section, I just got a little bit alarmed because I didn't want, as we all get so busy, Mr. Deputy Mayor, with a multitude of things, both citywide and within our wards, I didn't want a few months from now, if I raised it at the committee level or at council, a number of my colleagues to have said, Tom, we don't recall you mentioning it, nor is it in the minutes. So today by saying it publicly. Hopefully now it's on the website, and it's live streamed, and Stephanie, and hopefully at the School Board Property Subcommittee at the next meeting, Lorraine Kolar, our LA for the subcommittee, will just amend that accordingly. It was just to put everybody on notice because the school board will be ultimately putting that site up for sale, and I'll be interested in acquiring it. And again, I've got a multitude of partners that are part of working with me the last couple of years. And Mr. Deputy Mayor, just to refresh everyone's memory, the Broughton East site that I had hoped to acquire, the 9.5 acre site, a couple of years ago, and I was very grateful for Council's unanimous support. I got outbid by the French Catholic Board, hence the money that I had asked this council for has all been returned. I never got a chance to use it, so hopefully down the road that money can be redirected and reallocated with council support down the road towards the Henderson Barton site. Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Just want to get it on the record.
Councillor Marulli, on behalf of Councillor Collins, are you going to move this motion?
Yeah, I will, and it's seconded by Councillor Whitehead. And it's an amendment to item 5 of the School Board Property Subcommittee report, and that's subsection C to item 5 of the School Board's Property Subcommittee report respecting the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board land at 60 Caledon Avenue, Mountain Secondary School, Hamilton, Ward 8, be deleted in its entirety and replaced with the following. The staff be authorized and directed to advise the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board that subject to due diligence, the City of Hamilton has interest in acquiring the subject property at 60 Caledon Avenue, with the exception of the landlocked strip of land along the west side of the site, as shown on Appendix B attached to the report.
And that's seconded by Councillor Whitehead, who wishes to speak to it.
Yeah, I want to thank my council colleagues in committee. Yeovil is a population of about 35 to 4,000, according to the latest stats. It has no park. Zero. No green space. The green space they utilized was going across a very busy intersection of West 5th over to Captain Cornelius, or utilizing the green space that was provided by Mountain Secondary High School. The other challenge is Calvin Christian School. If they couldn't obtain a sliver of the land, they would no longer be viable and they would have to move. We found a solution in conjunction with the school board for Calvin Christian with that sliver. That's that landlocked piece they talk about in this motion. We are looking to preserve a small piece, so this is not like a major park, but this is at least for a lot of the young children in the community. Parents have to walk across a busy 4-lane West 5th. They can utilize the hopefully at some point a preserved small green space and play structures for those young children. And I know that some of my colleagues will be happy to know that we're, with the blessing of the Rolston neighborhood group in Yeovil, they are looking and partnering with a social housing provider on these lands to meet the needs of the community. So it's a nice balance. It meets all our objectives. And again, I thank my council colleagues for supporting.
All in favor? Any opposed? It passes. So, Madam Clerk, I would take any reference to 8.8 off of our in-camera list. Okay. I'll try to do that on the fly. And any notices of motion? Seeing none, no motions. So a motion to approve the amendments first before we get into private and confidential. These are on the outstanding business list before you. And on that, Councillor Skelly.
Thank you. If we could remove item 11.12, does that make sense? Thank you.
But, well, why would we remove it if we've tabled it? Okay, sorry. Councillor Jackson, I appreciate your good guidance here. Go ahead. My question is to you.
Councillor Skelly obviously she does not want a Roman numeral 2 removed as recommended because we tabled the matter for a lot more discussion down the road. So I didn't want it conflicting with the earlier discussion.
Very good.
Thank you.
Items to be removed as indicated here on point A, which I overlooked. Thank you very much. Councillor Jackson and Councillor Skelly. All in favor of this amended list? Sorry, on the amendment, all in favor? Any opposed?
Should we also not leave item 3 on the standing business list because that's got tabled till September?
Oh, good point. Good catch, as you've heard before, Councillor Ferguson. So that's seconded by Councillor Vanderbeek. All in favor? Oh, sorry. Let's have one motion.
One motion for both.
On holding off on Roman numeral 2 and 3 from Councillor Skelly and seconded by Councillor Jackson. All in favor? Any opposed? And now as amended, all in favor. Moved by Ferguson, seconded by Councillor Vanderbeek. That carries without any opposition. On to private and confidential. I need a motion to approve the July 10th closed session minutes as presented. That's moved by Councillor Whitehead, seconded by Councillor Brenda Johnson. All in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none. And now I need to move to closed session respecting items 12.2, 12.3, 12.4 pursuant to section 8.1, subsections B, C, E, and F of the city's procedural bylaw 14-300 and section 239, parentheses 2, subsections B, E, F of the Ontario Municipal Act 2001 as amended, as the subject matters pertain to personal matters about an identifiable individual, including city employees, litigation or potential litigation, including matters before administrative tribunals affecting the city, and the receiving of advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, including communications necessary for that purpose. Could I now ask that the public and any staff who are not required to be in the closed session meeting, please exit the chambers, taking all of your personal belongings with you. Members of the public, of course, will be invited to return to hear any further deliberations upon committee reconvening in open session, indicated by the removal of the frosting on the windows and the elimination of the white noise. The committee will, in the event they are in closed session for more than 30 minutes, wait up to 5 minutes upon reconvening in open session before proceeding with the meeting to provide members of the public and the media time to return to the meeting room. Thank you. So move to go in camera, moved by Councillor Brenda Johnson, second by Councillor Aidan Johnson. All in favor? Any opposed? That carries. So how many we got? So Conley was before me. Collins was beforehand. Who was before him? Whitehead?
Okay. Back in open session. Item 12.2, line of duty benefits. May I please have a mover and seconder for the following? That report HUR 17013 respecting line of duty death benefits remain confidential. Moved by Councillor Green, seconded by Councillor Pearson. All those in favor? Carried. Any opposed? Carried. Item 12.3, City versus Metcalfe Mansfield Corporation et al. FCS 09066E/LS 09006E. May I please have a mover and seconder for the following? A, that the direction provided to staff in closed session respecting these reports, the City of Hamilton versus Metcalfe Mansfield Corporation et al. Be approved, and B, that report FCSO 9066E and LS 09006E respecting the City of Hamilton versus Mansfield Corp et al. Remain confidential. Moved by Councillor Pearson, seconded by Councillor Brenda Johnson. All those in favor? Carried. Any opposed? Carried. Item 12.4, Tiger Cats Soccer at Tim Hortons Field. May I please have a mover and seconder for the following? Sam, you have a motion for this?
Yes, it's moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Ferguson, that staff be directed to refrain from any business with the Tiger Cats related to soccer at Tim Hortons Field until such time as the current litigation is resolved.
And we have a second part to it, so can we just add it to your motion? And that would be B, that report LS 17030 respecting Tiger Cats soccer at Tim Hortons Field remain confidential. So if we add that to that motion, so moved by Councillor Marula, seconded by Councillor Ferguson. All those in favor? Carried. Any opposed? Carried. Thank you. Moving on to new business. Councillor Green, you have something for new business?
Thank you. It's a question through you to, actually Rome would be the guy. When groups or community groups, when they go to rent and get seat applications on city property, what is the protocol for security used at, say, here, City Hall? What is permitted for the security here at City Hall?
Through the chair, I'm not involved in seat, but could you be more
well, specifically, there was a rally that was held here that used a third-party group, which is basically online as almost a militia, providing security for on public property. And I'm just unclear as to what the protocol is, because these people are not, as I understand, licensed with the city to be providing security, and yet they're on city grounds and basically as an enforcement for public events or for a public event.
Okay. Through the chair, any security or any use of a city facility would have to come through the facility management group, and we would provide the adequate security depending on the event or the nature of the event.
So I'd like to go on the record right now and state that this group that call themselves the 3 Percenters, this militia that is active in the city, talking about shock and awe and use of force and readying themselves for war on Canadian soil, be denied any access to providing security on any public properties in the city of Hamilton. Sorry? It's a specific group that I want banned that are not, no, I don't want to report, I just want to ban them. They're not sanctioned, they're not licensed. And what they're saying online, quite frankly, is terrifying for what they're trying to do here on city property. So through you to staff, if they're not licensed to be providing security through our seat process, then then all groups, but specifically this one, ought to be banned from doing the same. I don't think it needs feasibility. It just, as I'm hearing right now, it doesn't meet any of the requirements.
Through the chair, my understanding of that particular incident was that they didn't apply to be on city property. They just showed up. That was my understanding. And through our security office or through security personnel at the front desk, facilities was made aware of the situation after the fact.
So in situations like that, with these groups that come here in a paramilitary way to provide this so-called security, can we trespass them?
Through the chair, I don't think I'm able to answer that. I'm going to defer to legal. I'm not sure if they have an answer or a comment.
Well, okay, well then I guess hearing some of the unreadiness around the table, I'd like to have a full report back on who is allowed to provide security on city grounds for public events. And if you know, licensed or unlicensed, I understand that in liquor establishments and other places that the security there are licensed security people, contracted security people. Quite frankly, any of these groups that are domestic militia type groups, close combat organizations, 3 Presenters and others, quite frankly have no role or no business providing that type of role or function on public grounds. So that's my position. I want to state it here publicly right now. For a litany of reasons, I'm happy to take it up offline, but I'll be pursuing this. I'd like to ask for a staff to have a full report back on this, because what happened in Charleston or Charlesville, if for folks that don't think that it's potentially can happen here, you're kidding yourselves, because I'm seeing what these people are saying online and how they're preparing in ways that are violent, xenophobic, racist, homophobic, and the whole list. And I think that we need to take a stand on it right now to ensure they don't take hold, because when they're here, if we don't have police enforcing that, you're going to leave vulnerable people at risk on public property.
Councillor Marula.
I'll second the motion to have staff report back on the issue itself. with any suggestions.
Councillor Brenda Johnson. You're done? Okay. Okay, so moved by Councillor Green, seconded by Councillor Marula, that staff report back with a full report on the security issue. All those in favor? Any opposed? Carried. Thank you. May I please have a motion to adjourn? Councillor Brenda Johnson, Councillor Ferguson. All those in favor? Carried. Thank you very much.